Back in Aldbourne, the celebrations continued late into the night. Food was handed out from the stores, torches lit the streets, and even the noble quarter was opened for citizens to admire. Despite the festive atmosphere, Arthur remained on edge. He had brought in his own people to serve as the new local leaders, since the previous ones had proven themselves untrustworthy. The only exception was the deputy mayor. Roland had assured Arthur that the man had been successfully persuaded to support their cause. Even so, the city's bureaucracy was in shambles. The tax ledger had gone missing, and most of the treasury had disappeared. This is most displeasing. Please forgive me, my lord. I didn't know. The voice came from the young deputy mayor, who now stood before him. His name was Joseph. He was not even 30, unusually young for his position, and the perfect candidate to take the fall. Arthur suspected that the true mayor was already far away and would never return. Both his personal funds and the city's treasury had likely been emptied and sent to his brother. That was the only way he could escape without being branded a criminal for stealing from a Valyrian-controlled city. Sir Gareth, Sir Warren, please give our mayor some room to breathe. Yes, Lord Valyrian. Both knights nodded and stepped aside. Joseph was ordered to sit on a chair before Arthur, who had just finished reviewing the last of the documents the city official had managed to produce. Although the treasury was nearly empty, not everything had vanished. There were still reserves of food and medical supplies, along with a few hidden stockpiles of construction materials scattered throughout the noble quarter. We've taken control of the Thieves' Guild and a few other sources. It's not ideal, but it's a start. For now, it would have to suffice. He had spent over a year preparing for this campaign, and the first stage was complete. The next steps were already set in motion. With a quiet nod to himself, he rose and looked down at Joseph. Joseph, he said, his voice softer now but still commanding. You will stay on. Not as deputy mayor, but as the new mayor of Aldbourne. No, please, good lord, I will do anything. Joseph dropped to his knees and slammed his forehead against the wooden floor, convinced he was about to be struck down by one of Arthur's rapiers. His voice trailed off as he realized what had been said. You wish me to become the mayor? Yes. We need someone familiar with this city. You will be assigned an assistant, and we will choose a new deputy mayor for you to mentor. If you prove yourself loyal, you may keep this position permanently. I'll do my best, Lord Valyrian. Joseph, who had been terrified just moments before, now seemed to realize the situation might not be as dire as he had feared. He was being promoted to mayor at least for now. And there was a real possibility it could become permanent. Most importantly, he understood that as long as he remained useful, he would be allowed to live. That, above all else, was his priority. I'm sure you will, that will be all. I understand, my lord. Thank you. I won't fail you. You will not regret this, I will prove myself to be useful. The man continued to bow, over and over, like a madman on something far stronger than just fear. Arthur felt a flicker of discomfort at the display. The man's groveling made him seem like some bloodthirsty tyrant tormenting a helpless commoner. He had hoped people would respond to his leadership with respect, or at least cautious trust. Perhaps Joseph's fear had less to do with Arthur himself and more to do with his encounter with Roland. Arthur couldn't help but wonder what exactly his friend had done to convince the man to sign over all the necessary documents. Someone will be waiting outside. She will be your new assistant. Start by finding the families who lost someone during the city's defense and compile a list, no matter how small. Also include those who lost family in the months leading up to the dungeon break. Yes, my lord. Joseph didn't ask questions. He simply listened and obeyed. Arthur knew people had been captured and sold into slavery in this city. The more witnesses he could gather to testify against his brother, the stronger his case would be. Moments later, the young mayor exited the room, clutching the ledger Arthur had returned after reviewing its contents. As the door closed behind him, a female voice spoke from the shadows. I'm not sure we can trust him, Lord Arthur. That's why one of your maids is shadowing his every move. A robed figure stepped forward from the darkness, her voice instantly familiar. As she neared, she lowered her hood, revealing orange cat ears atop her head. Her movements were as silent as ever, so much so that even the 2 Tier 3 knights had failed to notice her presence until she was already inside the room, something that clearly annoyed her. You two need more training. What if I had been an enemy assassin? My apologies. Both knights lowered their heads like children being scolded by their mother. Arthur couldn't help but chuckle at the sight of his most trusted retainers interacting. He knew it had been Mary who allowed Gareth and Warren to land their blows on Alphonse, the high-ranking knight who had once seemed far beyond their reach. Though their strikes had connected, it was one of the leaders of the prosthetic-using knights who had delivered the final blow. Arthur crossed to the window, hands clasped behind his back as he looked out over Aldbourne. The city glowed softly under the moonlight. It was quiet now, though far from still. Somewhere below, plans were already unfolding. Some were his, others were not. Alphonse's fall had been swift and public. Thanks to Roland's recording, there was no ambiguity about the legality of Arthur's takeover. The recording clearly showed Alphonse rejecting Arthur's claim and refusing to recognize the charter that granted him the lawful right to assume leadership. This technology, the ability to record and replay the past, was both powerful and unsettling. It far surpassed the traditional use of powerful mages to glimpse into past events. That method was extremely difficult, unreliable, and accessible only to a few noble houses. The new recording technology had its own limitations in that it required a recording device to be present at the time of the event. However, once captured, the memory could be freely copied and replayed by almost any rune mage. One of such mages, a trusted friend of his high commander, had already made his way towards the place Arthur needed to tackle next, the noble court. How long until the noble court reviews the matter? Arthur asked quietly. Mary stepped beside him, her feline eyes glowing faintly in the low light. A few days at most. Sir Wayland sent the recording through the approved channels. By now, perhaps even the High Seat will have seen it. Arthur gave a slow nod. And Theodore? Mary's expression darkened. Just as we expected. He's not sending more troops. Reports suggest he's redirecting his forces to the northern passes and the main roads. It seems he expects his older brother to act, but our spies have confirmed that Julius has made no move. On the contrary, Lord Arthur. Mary paused, her expression shifting as concern crept into her features. What is it? Arthur asked while raising his brow. It's better if you read this yourself. She handed him a few pages from a report. Arthur scanned the contents quickly, his eyes widening with each line. This. Isgard, how could this be? Was the dungeon break truly this devastating? Mary gave a slow nod. It seems the capital city took the worst of it. Tier 4 monsters were seen in the area, and even Orichalcum-ranked adventuring parties were called in. Some of their members fell during the fighting. Arthur's thoughts swirled. He had not anticipated that his father's stronghold would suffer such a devastating blow. According to the report, the monsters had breached the city and caused widespread destruction. Casualties were high, and the fate of many residents remained unknown. The only certainty was that his father had survived, or at least that was what had been reported. Arthur knew that if anything had happened to him, his father would likely go to great lengths to conceal it. Are you all right, Lord Arthur? Yes, I'm fine. In truth, he felt little affection for his father or for the people who lived in that cold and distant castle. He preferred not to recall the years he had spent there. His youth had been anything but joyful. Only his mother had brought light to that place, the one person who could pierce through the constant gloom that surrounded his childhood. His father had been her shield, the only reason she had remained unharmed. As long as the Duke stayed in power, her safety was assured. If one of Arthur's brothers rose to that position, he feared for her life. But what should I do? Would they even allow me an audience with father? To confirm his father's condition, Arthur would need to go there and see him in person. Yet the timing could not have been worse. If he left now, Theodore might seize the opportunity to make a move. Just as he began weighing his options, something in the report caught his eye, something he had nearly overlooked. Wait, what is this? A section he had nearly missed. There was more. Something unexpected. Something unsettling, but also something that could change into a possibility. This could be a chance but also a trap. His eyes narrowed at an opportunity that presented itself. He wasn't sure if it was a good or bad thing, but it didn't seem he would have a choice in this matter. Where is our High Commander now? While speaking, Arthur tossed the report into the nearby fireplace. The paper caught fire immediately, glowing orange before crumbling into ash. Mary paused for a moment, then spoke. He should be working on the teleportation gate. Should I call him here? Yes, that would be best. Arthur replied as he lowered himself into the chair at his desk. His eyes drifted to a crystal resting on its side. It was the same type used in the Ascension ritual. All the requirements had finally been met. The title he earned from leading his forces was the final one he needed. He had pushed himself relentlessly. His skills had been trained to their peak. He had hunted monsters to master combat, studied every text that might offer insight, and ensured there were no weaknesses left in his preparation. Now, the moment had come to ascend to the next stage of power. Without his friend, he knew he would never complete it in time. I wonder how Arian is doing, he didn't seem too eager about going to the noble court. Roland thought to himself as he connected the final parts of the teleportation gate. The dwarves had prepared everything in advance, leaving him with the task of welding the components together using his magic. The city had been captured, the necessary evidence had been secured, and now all they could do was wait. The battle was over, and he had played a key role in securing their victory. His golems, along with Lucille's, now patrolled the streets under the cover of night. There had been a few complaints from the townspeople, but for now, they were forbidden from wandering outside. The official reason given was the danger of monster attacks, which was not a lie. The guildmaster was already organizing adventuring parties to handle the remaining threats. Their army had done its job, and now it was up to others to finish the task. In the past, after a culling event, adventurers would spread out to clear the surrounding villages. Many of those who had lived there were now temporarily housed in this city and nearby settlements. The rumors Roland had circulated had proven effective. People had been ordered to evacuate the less defensible areas to reduce casualties. Now, just as in those earlier times, adventurers would reclaim the abandoned villages and hunt down any monsters that remained. I might have to stay here for a while. This city now belonged to them by law, but Roland knew that Theodore would not see it that way. Once he realized that his brother Julius was not coming to his aid, he would no doubt bring his full army to their doorstep. The 3,000 troops they had defeated, along with the few Tier 3 class holders they had captured, were nothing compared to Theodore's main force. Even if they made their stand in Albrook, with the golem defenses fully operational, Roland was not confident they could withstand a full assault. Theodore had been building his power base for over a decade. In contrast, Arthur and Roland had only just begun. At least with this, we will have a way to escape if anything happens. The situation was far from ideal, but the teleportation gate gave them a vital advantage. It offered mobility, a way out if things went wrong. Still, Roland saw another problem on the horizon, one that was far less deadly but much more personal. He had no idea how he was going to explain any of this to the headmistress. She had already been reluctant to grant him any leniency, and he had skipped lectures just to be here. I'm sure she will understand. Nothing has been happening at the institute since then. He had been diligently performing his duties and had equipped the entire facility with a monitoring system. There was little reason for him to remain on site, aside from occasionally giving lectures and explaining rune magic to the students. He had even acquired a personal assistant capable of delivering the lectures in his place. With the learning tools he had developed, the curriculum was now complete. Perhaps the headmistress would be more lenient if he decided to make a request. Even so, he had no desire to stand before a Tier 4 class holder unless absolutely necessary. Still, that woman might be the least of his concerns, as he was suddenly interrupted. Sir Wayland, the Lord wishes to speak with you. I'll be there soon. What is the meaning of this? Wasn't Julius involved in all of this? Who gave me this faulty information? In a dimly lit room, an angry noble with a prominent beak-like nose hurled a stack of papers at the butler standing before him. The man didn't move. He took the blow to his face without so much as a flinch. The papers fluttered to the ground like autumn leaves. The nobleman, Lord Theodore Valerian, seethed with barely contained fury as he paced across the length of his study. I stationed troops in all my cities. I disrupted trade. I forced my allies into submission. For nothing. The butler straightened his posture as the final sheet of paper settled at his feet. He waited in silence, as he had done for years, until the tirade began to fade. No sudden moves from Julius. Not even from Yvonne. Did that bastard really orchestrate all of this? No. I won't believe it. I was made to look like a fool. And Arthur walks into Aldbourne as if it belongs to him. The noble continued hurling curses and objects around the room before finally collapsing into his chair. He furrowed his brows and leaned back, exhaling through clenched teeth. Only then did the butler speak. My lord, this just arrived. It bears the seal of the noble court. Theodore froze. His rampage came to an abrupt end as he turned toward the butler in disbelief. The noble court. The butler stepped forward and presented a thick envelope, sealed with red wax and a crest inlaid with faint gold. Theodore snatched it from his hands and sliced it open with a flick of his knife. His eyes narrowed as he read. "They're summoning me? Preposterous." It now seemed that Arthur had been the perpetrator all along, and Theodore was being summoned to answer for Alphonse's wrongdoings. The veins on his forehead bulged with renewed fury. Yet the butler remained calm, standing silently with another letter in hand. This one bore the mark of the Valerian household, though it was unusual, almost identical to the seal used for the Grand Assembly, the gathering of all nobles from across the island. "A letter from father?" Arthur asked with a hint of confusion on his face. He was in his study with two others. One was his trusted maid and bodyguard, Mary. The other was his most capable ally, Roland, known to most as High Commander Wayland. "Yes, Lord Arthur. It arrived as soon as we returned from Aldbourne," Mary replied as she handed him the letter bearing the Valerian seal. "Do you want me to step out?" Roland asked. He had sensed that the matter might be personal. "No. Stay. It is probably related to the culling." "But this seal," Arthur said as he examined it more closely. Something about it felt wrong. It was not just the familiar stag that represented his house. A forest surrounded the emblem along with 4 shields, suggesting something more. This was not a letter meant only for him. Others had received it as well. It was a summons to the Grand Assembly. Arthur turned the letter over in his hand. The wax seal caught the morning light, almost as if daring him to break it. Mary and Roland waited in silence, sensing the weight of the moment. After a short pause, Arthur pressed his thumb to the seal and broke it. His eyes scanned the contents quickly at first, then slowed as the message sank in. When he finally lowered the parchment, his expression was unreadable. His face had turned to stone. "They are calling the assembly within a fortnight. Attendance is mandatory for all nobles who hold ruling rights. Even you? Is this about the culling, or something else entirely?" Roland asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "We still have the courts reviewing the succession claims in Aldbourne. Could this be something Theodore is behind?" Arthur paused for a moment as he took in Roland's words and then replied. "That possibility is zero. The only person who can summon the Grand Assembly is my father. Yet something about this feels wrong. Normally, it takes a full month to complete the monster head count. Roaming beasts must be counted too. After that, the winners are announced and a grand ball is held." He fell quiet, unsure of the letter's true purpose. It felt too sudden. Something had changed. Perhaps it was the state of Isgard that had forced his father's hand. Perhaps they just want to assess the damage across the realm and assign duties directly. Or they want us to give them funds for the rebuilding efforts. Roland added, his tone grim. A public show of unity, followed by a quiet shakedown. It was a simple idea, but Arthur was not convinced. Would they truly summon so many nobles only to demand money? His father, the Duke, could issue a decree and face no opposition. There had to be more to this summons. If he had received a letter, then his brothers would have too. That meant he would soon be in the same room as many who had despised him for years. 2 weeks. Arthur murmured. "Can I do it in 2 weeks?" Roland caught on to what the young noble was referring to and responded quickly. "Well, it's possible. You have been preparing for a while now. If that is the case, you might be able to manage it on the 2nd or 3rd attempt." "2nd or 3rd?" Arthur repeated quietly. He was not sure where Roland's confidence came from. He had expected to have more than a month for the next step in his plan, which was to reach Tier 3. There had been a strong chance he would be invited to the ball that followed the culling, and he had hoped to display the personal strength he had gained. With Roland's help, he had trained relentlessly. He had leveled many of his skills and pushed himself to the peak of Tier 2. The progress he had made in such a short time was nothing short of remarkable. He had believed that, once others saw his growth, they would finally begin to take him seriously. That had been the plan. But now, with only 2 weeks left, he faced a challenge that even the most talented usually needed a full month or more to overcome. A lord's work is never that simple. Arthur mumbled to himself, though he was not alone in his efforts. Roland was not there just to read the letter. He had come for another purpose entirely, to help Arthur retain memories from within the Ascension space. From what Arthur had heard, Roland had made real progress in that field and had already helped Durandal and Cortana advance through some of the more difficult classes. The class Arthur was pursuing was especially challenging to attain, so he needed all the help he could get. It is not impossible, so why don't we just begin? Every second counts. Roland said. I suppose you are right, my friend. In a way, the Grand Assembly works in our favor. My brother Theodore will be unable to move his forces. Arthur replied. There were strict rules regarding the assembly. Once it was announced, all ongoing battles and disputes among the nobility had to cease immediately. That meant Theodore could not make a move to retake Aldbourne, even if he wanted to. Although the trial would be postponed, the delay would give them precious time to reinforce the city with additional golems and troops. It would give them enough time to establish a proper defense and prevent even a larger force from breaching the city. At present, Sir Durandal, Lady Cortana, and Sir Wiscard had remained behind to defend Aldbourne. The knights equipped with runic prosthetics had proven to be their most powerful assets. However, despite their strength, the prosthetics required frequent maintenance, something only Roland fully understood. Even so, Arthur had other matters to focus on. Reaching Tier 3 would finally allow him to step beyond the role of a helpless bystander. It was the only way he could stand on equal ground with the others and defend what was his. Well then, I put myself in your capable hands. After disposing of the letter, Arthur turned to Roland, who was meant to assist him in retaining memories from the Ascension trial he was about to undertake. Roland gave a curt nod and gestured toward the exit with a gloved hand. I have already made the arrangements, but we will need to move to my own workshop. The underground level of the mansion is not suited for this kind of procedure just yet. Procedure? Arthur repeated, raising an eyebrow at the choice of words. He chose not to question it further. Roland had never given him a reason to doubt his loyalty. The mage engineer had proven himself trustworthy more than once. The workshop was located beneath Roland's estate, and they reached it by traveling through one of the secret tunnels that ran under the city. Over the past year, they had worked hard to construct a network of escape routes. One of them began beneath Arthur's mansion and ended directly beneath Roland's home. Roland led Arthur through the winding, surprisingly well-lit tunnel, their footsteps echoing softly off the stone walls. On the ground, Arthur noticed something that looked like tracks, though they didn't yet stretch the entire length of the passage. Roland had mentioned plans for an underground railway, and this was just a prototype. For now, it served only to help them move more quickly during their escape. But in the future, when the city grew more crowded, such a system could become essential. The roads above were already choked with carriages, bulky tamed beasts, and a constant flow of pedestrians. Once they arrived, a door stood waiting for them. Arthur still found himself marveling at the magic used in this place. Sections of the tunnel behind them were sealed off by doors that had dropped down, designed to block any pursuers. Along the walls, he noticed runes etched into the stone. According to Roland, these runes would detonate if a retreat ever became necessary. This escape route wasn't just clever, it was crafted by someone who should be working for royalty. He really doesn't belong in a city this small. As Arthur stepped into Roland's workshop, a knot of unease tightened in his chest. His friend was brilliant, perhaps even dangerously so. He was not yet 30, and he had already achieved things that would leave seasoned masters speechless. If he wished, he could easily earn a place in a respected laboratory in the capital. It was certain that the high nobles would take notice, and perhaps even the royal family would seek his skills. Rune craftsmen were extremely rare, and human ones at his level were almost unheard of. That fact alone made Roland stand out. For reasons Arthur still could not fully understand, this remarkable individual had chosen to work with him. I have to rise to this. I cannot afford to fail. I cannot remain a burden anymore. Although he felt the urge to congratulate himself for winning his first true large-scale battle, Arthur knew the truth. He would never have succeeded without Roland's inventions. His current strength, his rapid rise in rank, none of it would have been possible on his own. Without Roland's help, he would likely still be trapped in Albrook, living in obscurity as a nameless bastard no one respected. We're here. Take a seat and try to relax. Eventually, he was led to a room. It was a simple, white space with no decoration except for a single chair positioned at the center, surrounded by a half-circle of softly glowing consoles. Runes pulsed gently along the walls and floor, casting faint blue ripples that shimmered across the sterile surface. The room was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The only sound came from the low hum of mana coursing through the runic conduits and wires that spread through the chamber. Arthur stepped inside slowly, his eyes fixed on the chair. It appeared ordinary at first glance, made of polished steel and dark leather, but the air around it buzzed with magic. It sat directly in the center of several runic circles etched into both the floor and ceiling. Thick cables stretched from the consoles to the chair, and attached to it was a helmet-like device. The helmet looked simple, more like a metallic bowl, though it was covered in detailed runes. You designed all this just for the memory retention procedure? Arthur asked as he lowered himself into the chair. He tried to sound calm, but a slight tremor in his voice gave him away. Yes and no. Roland replied. It started with that, but I'm also using it to analyze the ascension ritual itself. A lot of people think it's a blessing from the gods and we are taken into their realm, but I'm not convinced yet. Arthur blinked. Oh, probably best not to tell the church about that. I know. They'd most likely try to brand me a heretic, perhaps even you for using such technology. Ha, well, better not say anything then. Roland gave a small nod and activated the chair. It shifted beneath Arthur, slowly reclining until he was forced to lie back. The movement was smooth, but something about it made him uneasy. It reminded him of the old torture devices he had seen in the underground dungeons. Thankfully, there were no cuffs or restraints on it. Just relax and enter your ascension space. Once you're back, focus on the trial. Try to recall the important parts, like what you need to accomplish, any potential shortcuts, or hidden loopholes. There's always a simpler way to get through those trials. It's better to find it early rather than too late. Good, then let us begin. Mary. Mary nodded and stepped forward, placing the ascension crystal into Arthur's hand. The metallic bowl rested on his head now, and Roland moved away toward the console. Arthur glanced at him one last time, then closed his eyes and gripped the crystal. As the magic surged through him, the room faded. He felt the familiar pull, a gentle shift that drew him away from the present. When the sensation settled, he found himself standing in a place he knew well, the courtyard of his old mansion, the home he had shared with his mother for so many years. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue across the garden path. The air smelled of lilacs and freshly cut grass. Before Arthur stood the pale marble steps of a villa, nestled atop a gentle hill, half shaded by towering moon willow trees. Its architecture was a fusion of elven grace and human practicality, arched windows, ivy-covered balconies, and carved magical characters faintly glowing across the outer wall. He felt the breeze brush his cheek, as if it carried a voice from the past. The illusion was perfect. Too perfect. Just one person is still missing. Arthur placed his hand against one of the trees in the center of the courtyard. There, faint scratches marked in the bark represented records of his height over the years. His mother had brought him here every birthday to measure how much he had grown. It was a quiet tradition, one that had meant everything to him. But this place wasn't real. It was only a reflection, a projection of safety shaped by his mind. This was the space of the Ascension trial, a familiar illusion drawn from memory. No other beings were present. The mansion, the trees, the quiet breeze, they were all echoes of something long gone. I only realized it was all an illusion after my 10th birthday. He began to walk, his thoughts drifting back to those early years. There was no sign of danger here. No looming mountains, no volcanic ash, just clear skies and the gentle sound of birds. The courtyard had been a kind of cage, elegant and warm, but a cage nonetheless. A place meant to shield his mother and him from the outside world and, more specifically, to keep others from seeing his half-elven heritage. He remembered the glowing runes that maintained the illusion, hidden in the walls and woven into everything. It wasn't until he received his first class at 10 that he began to understand the truth. What had seemed like a sanctuary was a prison, and his mother had been its quiet prisoner. Arthur's steps slowed as he reached the villa's entrance, a door carved from deep wood and inlaid with silver characters. His hand hovered above the doorknob, hesitant. Beyond that door was where his future waited. He found it a bit ironic, to seek future progress while seeing a representation of his past. Just like before, he needed to go to his old bedchamber and choose. With a slow breath, he turned the knob and stepped inside. If he made all the correct steps, then the class that he wished to achieve would be waiting for him, if not then he would probably need to settle for something lesser as time for him was running out. If he couldn't present himself to his father as someone extraordinary now, he would probably not be taken seriously as a proper candidate. Signs look normal, he should be back in a few seconds, so get ready. I'm always ready. Mary replied, standing calmly beside Roland with a pillow in her hand. Roland kept his eyes fixed on the display screen. He had built this setup after carefully studying the Ascension trials of Robert, Lucille, and many others. With each trial, he gathered more data, gradually working to uncover the deeper truths behind the process. His understanding of souls had started with his encounter with the witch. That strange meeting had introduced him to the idea that the soul could temporarily leave the body. Through further research, he confirmed that during the Ascension trial, the soul vanished briefly before returning with the information it had gathered. Although he couldn't interfere with the process itself, he had shifted his focus to what happened afterward. When the soul returned, the experience was stored in the brain, though the memories were fragile and faded quickly. Certain spells could extend the retention period, and with the help of his latest setup, he planned to have Sebastian assist in preserving the excess data. The time window was short, but even a few seconds of clarity could yield valuable insights into the trial. And now the moment had arrived. A subtle shift in the readings confirmed it. Arthur's soul had returned. He quickly activated the procedure, and right before his eyes a series of pictures started appearing. The visuals were sometimes blurry or out of focus, but others clear. He had done it, his creation was working, and with this perhaps succeeding in 2 weeks wouldn't be a pipe dream anymore. The helmet pulsed with a soft azure glow as the readings stabilized. Roland leaned in and tapped the panels with his fingers as the process began. The memory transfer is going through. Feed is steady. A dozen screens flickered to life across the console. Each displayed fragmented but vivid images, glimpses of Arthur's trial unfolding like scenes from a tale. Mary stood silently nearby, holding the pillow steady beneath Arthur's limp head. Her eyes remained focused on her lord, though she occasionally glanced at the flashing lights around the room. Most of them were in muted shades of grey, offering very little color in between. This looks familiar. A castle appeared, perched on a misty ridge and surrounded by wild, untamed land. It looked half-ruined, with only a single banner fluttering in the wind. The symbol on it resembled Arthur's own crest. It was faded, barely recognizable, yet clearly marked with the emblem of the Valyrian household. This must be what he saw first when he arrived. Then came the rest. The memories appeared fragmented, displayed like a slideshow highlighting key moments. First came a main settlement or fortress, similar to the keep he had once defended during his Tier 3 trial. Back then, he had taken the role of overlord, charged with conquering surrounding lands to secure victory. From what the images revealed, Arthur now faced a similar challenge. Next, a council chamber filled with advisors appeared before Arthur. They wore strange masks that resembled those used in dramatic performances to portray basic emotions. Most of the expressions showed fear, exhaustion, or shame. They were all negative, which made Roland wonder if they were tied to the nature of the trial. Perhaps once the trial concluded, the emotions would shift to more positive ones. Ledgers, maps, and resource tallies were laid out across a large central table, much like the one used in their own war room. A detailed map of the region was spread across its surface, and the settlement where Arthur had arrived appeared to be positioned right at the center. As in Roland's trial, other forces surrounded this location, each holding more territory and possessing greater resources. Will he have to conquer the other places, or is the win condition something else? Roland thought. In his own trial, his role had been that of an overlord, one who ruled over lesser lords and brought all regions under a single banner. But Arthur's objective might be different. Until they gathered more data, there was no way to be certain. At least the people in the chamber weren't wooden constructs. Instead, they wore masks that seemed fused to their faces, as if part of their very being. Roland leaned in closer as the view shifted once again. Arthur now stood in the center of a crumbling throne room. The same masked advisors were gathered around him, either kneeling or standing in a wide arc. Although their voices could not be heard, their gestures made their intent clear. They were waiting for instructions. Even more surprisingly, Roland managed to catch a snapshot of the system display Arthur had seen. He had not thought that would be possible. Welcome, Lord of the Hollow Keep. Your trial begins now. Primary objective, sustain and uplift. Survive for 14 cycles and raise your domain to a Tier 2 fiefdom. Secondary objective, uncover the true nature of your council. Roland studied the display with a furrowed brow. The system was offering more specific guidance than usual, and this trial appeared to focus more on survival than on conquest. The objective did not mention battle or territory expansion. Arthur was meant to manage and improve his holdings as a lord. The wording left room for interpretation, which likely meant he could succeed through multiple strategies. Trade, diplomacy, and wise governance might be just as effective as warfare. Running a struggling kingdom under pressure with a time limit reminded Roland of his own experience. Building structures, defending key locations, delegating authority, and managing limited resources would likely play major roles in success. Arthur might still need to form an army, but overall the challenge seemed less brutal than the one Roland had faced. With Arthur's natural charisma, he might find more success through alliances and negotiations. The next images reinforced Roland's analysis. Arthur stood in the castle courtyard, examining his surroundings. A few dozen soldiers marched in uneven lines, poorly armed and lacking discipline. Food supplies were dangerously low. The smithy was barely functioning. Most troubling of all were red markers at the edges of the regional map. These signaled the presence of enemy forces. Perhaps they were raiders, or maybe rival lords. Each cycle, likely representing a week or a month within the trial, would require Arthur to make important decisions. He would have to choose which areas to improve, which threats to respond to, and which people to rely on. This was not a simple combat challenge. It was a test filled with countless variables, many of which would be difficult to predict. Fortunately, the runic memory machine offered a possible advantage. If they could collect enough data, they might begin to uncover patterns hidden within the trial's structure. Roland planned to assign Sebastian to analyze the numbers and track how Arthur's choices affected each outcome. With sufficient information, they could prepare a strategy guide that would give Arthur a large advantage upon his return. Lord Arthur, please don't move. Arthur began to wake, and Roland realized there was little time left to continue the memory storage process. Even so, more information continued to surface, revealing how Arthur had tried to manage the unfolding situation. Numerous decrees had been issued, each one aimed at stabilizing his domain. He had also launched an investigation into his council in an effort to fulfill the secondary objective, which suggested the presence of a possible traitor. It was difficult to determine the exact details of Arthur's orders, but from the available fragments, it appeared that he began by rationing food and deploying his army to stabilize the surrounding regions. Later, he tried to develop farmland and initiated trade with more neutral lords. This effort required travel, negotiations, and the building of alliances, including at least one formed through marriage, something that still haunted Roland in his sleep. Despite these efforts, Arthur always seemed just a little too slow in making key decisions. In the end, he did not survive the trial. The final memory showed him standing at the gallows, while one of the masked men watched from the crowd. This particular mask bore an unsettling grin, and based on his attire, it was clear that he had been a member of the council. He had remained hidden throughout, never exposed as the traitor. That's the gist of it. Mary stayed by Arthur's side and had been given the task of asking him what he could remember. His recollection was limited, mostly fading after the first few cycles and leading up to his eventual death. Still, with the help of the stored visual records, they hoped to jog his memory and piece together more of what had happened during the trial. How do you feel? As if I was gone for a year or more. It wasn't this bad during my last trial. Roland didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the final frozen image on the screen, showing Arthur standing tall but clearly defeated, the traitor's grinning mask visible in the crowd of angry masks. After a long breath, he finally turned to face him. It is a fitting trial for someone who aims to become a lord. You just need to adapt faster and probably identify the traitor a lot sooner. Roland responded while glancing at the screens. There was one flaw: his friend had never overcome his tendency to rely too heavily on others. Arthur often seemed to carry an inferiority complex when compared to his brothers. In matters concerning the city, he deferred to Roland frequently and rarely contradicted his advice. While this cautious approach might have worked in favor of Roland, it was not the mark of a true leader, and not for someone who aspired to become one. Perhaps this dependence on trusted advisors had been Arthur's greatest weakness. Within the trial, he had no one to trust but himself. It demanded confidence in his own judgment, something he clearly had not yet learned to rely on. I felt like I was constantly falling behind. Too many things to watch out for, and never enough time. Arthur rubbed his temples with unsteady hands. The mental toll of the trial was clear. The longer one remained inside, the more pressure it placed on the mind. Fortunately, Roland had embedded several protective runes to ease the worst effects. Because of that, Arthur would come away from the ordeal with nothing more than a mild migraine. Roland gave him a moment, then adjusted the chair to a sitting position. Mary remained there as if worried that he would fall over at any moment. However, the combination of mending runes and restorative ones made the pain quickly fade away, but the change in Arthur was there. At least, for a moment before the memories started to be forcefully erased, something even Roland couldn't do anything about. I think we have some good data, Go rest for now, I'll come back to you later. I'll take you up on that offer, my friend. Arthur gave a slow nod and finally rose from the chair. He was in better condition than most who had gone through similar trials, but he still needed time to recover. Roland understood the toll well, having endured over a year inside his own trial. Arthur's experience seemed to include a time acceleration feature as well, suggesting he had likely spent several months within that simulated world, but also that he had grown older. Considering this was such an elaborate trial, it might take a while until the next time you can start it, so take your time. Roland replied, and once Arthur and Mary had left the chamber, it was time to begin the analysis. Sebastian, analyze the trial. Scan for all available details and any hidden meanings within the images. As you wish, Master. Sebastian's voice echoed from deeper within the chamber. At first, it sounded disembodied, but a moment later, a figure stepped into view. It was a golem, dressed in what resembled a tailored butler's suit, with a body that was nearly human in its proportions. Lucille had clearly enjoyed designing him a bit too much, and now his construction had reached completion. His face, once minimal and expressionless, now looked almost doll-like and somewhat uncannily close to human, but still not quite natural. The subtle unease in his gaze remained, but his movements and expressions had begun to resemble those of a real person. His body was crafted from a porcelain-like material, smooth and pure white, gleaming faintly like a polished pearl. Sebastian stepped forward with the grace of a proper butler. Thanks to Lucille's expertise as a rune mage, several programs had been crafted to shape his personality. Over time, it had become something of a hobby for her. She had modeled his behavior to reflect that of a noble servant, complete with the habits and mannerisms expected of one. Even now, this tower spirit, who was also a supercomputer, approached with a drink balanced perfectly on a silver tray. Sir, your fluid intake has been rather low. Ah, sure, thank you, Sebastian. Roland accepted the cup of black tea, brewed to his preferred taste, and took a sip. With that, the pattern analysis began. Commencing pattern analysis. Estimated time to completion, 17 hours, 25 minutes, and 23 seconds. Real-time updates will be provided. Sebastian had evolved into a supercomputer that not only handled complex calculations but also managed many of the magical systems within the city. He was responsible for activating the runic lights at sunset and alerting the guards if any crimes occurred. Citizens had begun purchasing the runic home appliances he had designed, which replicated the functions of refrigerators, showers, and even microwaves. With Sebastian overseeing their operation, these devices could be shut down instantly in case of an accident. To support this growing network, his computing power had been steadily expanded through continuous upgrades to the mainframe where he was housed. This place is starting to look like a server room, or a nuclear reactor. He stepped out of the chamber where he and Arthur had been and made his way toward the room that housed Sebastian's true core. Through a narrow gap in the door, he peered inside and saw a space filled with cables and tall pillars edged with glowing runic symbols. The base of each structure was submerged in a transparent coolant that helped preserve the delicate enchantments. At the center stood Sebastian's core, composed of intricate honeycomb-like structures that formed the foundation of his intelligence. The surrounding pillars boosted his processing capabilities, though they could not function as a tower spirit on their own. They served only to support the core, amplifying his reach and effectiveness across the city. The plan was to expand Sebastian across the entire island, but there were several obstacles. The biggest challenge was the cabling. Although there was technology that could imitate wireless communication through magic, it came with a major flaw. Anti-magical devices and skilled mages could easily detect and interfere with the transmission of information. Mana was an unpredictable energy source. It was present almost everywhere and in everything. Despite its abundance and ease of use, it couldn't be monopolized. It was vulnerable to interference from monsters and other magical artifacts. Roland considered whether he could create something similar to radio towers. To generate a strong enough signal, though, he would likely need infrastructure on the scale of a fully developed magic tower. The only realistic way he could see this working was by installing runic transceivers inside the existing magic towers spread throughout the kingdom. But that would require permission from the lords, and such approval would likely be impossible without support from a duke or even the king. Still, there was another potential solution. To connect with other cities, at least within Dragna's island, he could use the network of underground tunnels created by the dungeon. These tunnels extended beneath the entire island and might provide a stable route for the necessary connections. This had become the focus of Roland's current research and frustration. While Arthur was working toward earning his Tier 3 class, Roland was trying to uncover the secrets of the underground tunnels and understand how they had remained undiscovered for so long. Now that the levels of mana pollution had been significantly reduced, his golems were able to spread out in all directions and begin mapping the entire network. The scale of the tunnels far exceeded his initial expectations. The tunnels were reinforced with mana, forming rock that was nearly as strong as dwarven steel. Although the exit tunnels, where monsters had once emerged, had been destroyed, the main passages remained intact. Some rubble had accumulated, but clearing it with the appropriate golems would be a simple task. Roland began to envision laying cables throughout the island, alongside a full railway system. The tunnels were wide enough to support trains and carts without issue. While teleportation technology did exist, it remained less cost-effective than rail transport. In addition, a railway could operate continuously without the cooldown periods required to prevent overloading the runes used in teleportation. We've discovered a few pockets of iron, copper, and nickel. It's probably worth the investment. What began as a project for silent travel had revealed far more potential than anyone had anticipated. The tunnels ran deep underground, branching out in every direction. Along the way, some walls intersected with mineral veins and other valuable resources. With the mana density now reduced, it was possible to deploy runic sensors capable of scanning everything within a 100-meter radius. The sheer size of the underground network was staggering. No one had ever thought to dig so deep in search of resources, but now they didn't have to. If we're lucky, we might even find precious metals. Gold, platinum. Who knows? Maybe even star metal? Why is it that whenever I finish one task, another immediately appears? Am I cursed or something? Roland sighed. He had hoped for at least a few months of peace before the next major undertaking, but that now seemed impossible. He still needed to investigate the origins of the tunnels and locate the entrance to the super dungeon he had long wanted to explore. On top of that, the Great Assembly was approaching. It was a political obligation he wished he could avoid, but in 2 weeks, he would need to depart to the place where all of Arthur's brothers would be gathering. Lord Arthur, you haven't slept in 2 days. You need to take a break. There is no time for that, Mary. I need to prepare as much as I can. Books lay scattered across the wooden floor like fallen leaves, dozens of thick tomes with cracked spines and yellowed pages. Maps covered the walls, overlapping charts and diagrams creating a tangled web of strategy and governance. Arthur sat hunched over his desk, fingers pressed to his temples, trying to absorb one more page, one more theory, one more tactic. Candlelight flickered beside him, casting restless shadows across the room. He looked worn down. His usually sharp eyes had dulled, dark circles heavy beneath them. His tunic was wrinkled, the collar half unfastened, and a thin sheen of sweat clung to his brow. Scrolls lay open on every available surface, records of diplomatic successes, failed alliances, siege plans, taxation systems, and magic engineering notes. He was clearly combing through every piece of knowledge that might help him pass the trial. But my lord, think of your health. What if? Before Mary could finish, Arthur cut her off. What if I don't pass and run out of time? The assembly is approaching. This might be my last chance. His voice rose as frustration crept in, but he managed to steady himself before continuing. He understood how unusual his class was, and the more unique the class, the longer the wait between trials had become. Normally, the next stage would begin after a day. For him, nearly 3 days had passed with no sign. If the delay stretched beyond 6 days, he feared he would lose the opportunity altogether. We need to leave soon. I cannot afford to stop now. Don't worry, the elixirs and stamina potions should carry me through. Once the trial is over, I'll get some proper sleep. Mary remained silent, her eyes drifting to the empty bottles scattered across the desk. In theory, the magic within them would restore energy and calm the mind, mimicking the effects of rest. But such effects had limits. Without a high-level sleep-resistance skill and a body conditioned to endure strain, the potions would eventually lose their effectiveness. Roland had both. Arthur did not. Is there something important? If not, then please let me be, Mary. Ah, yes. Here, Lord Arthur. These are notes from Sir Wayland regarding the trial. He asked me to give them to you. Arthur took the packet of notes with trembling hands. His fingers were stained with ink and smudged with graphite from hours of scribbling annotations. The moment the parchment touched his palm, he felt a faint pulse and saw a rune emerge. The text began to glow with a bluish hue, and in that instant, the transfer of knowledge surged through him. This was not the first time he had encountered this kind of spell, but he knew its use came with strict limitations. It only worked when the author inscribed the text in a precise way, constantly channeling mana into the parchment using a specialized quill and enchanted ink. His friend Roland still had scribe skills and had mastered this technique. Through these magical notes, Arthur could quickly grasp the underlying structure of the trial and discern the patterns that would help him uncover the traitor and secure victory. Fascinating. When the process ended, he emerged from the trance-like state. His fingers rested on the final page, trembling slightly as the last threads of Roland's enchanted knowledge settled into his mind. Arthur blinked, trying to steady his breathing as the rush of information began to fade. The exhaustion he had been suppressing seemed to lift for a moment, but then his body gave in. He slumped forward against the desk. Mary caught his head gently, as though she had been expecting this exact moment. The surge of knowledge had overwhelmed him, and though the information would remain with him, he would be forced to rest. It was a known side effect, one Mary had quietly hoped for. Rest well, my lord. Once you wake, perhaps you will be one step closer to your goal. She didn't move him from the chair, afraid that any shift might wake him. Instead, she let him rest gently against the desk. Mary carefully draped a cloak over his shoulders, then began quietly gathering the scattered books from the floor. Many were filled with scribbled notes in Arthur's hurried handwriting. Titles like Diplomatic Webs of the Kingdom, Foundations of Farming in Monorich Regions, and Tyrants, Traitors, and Tacticians spoke volumes about what he had been trying to learn. Her gaze drifted to the wall behind him. There, the emblem of the Valyrian household hung in pristine condition. When they first arrived in this small settlement that barely qualified as a city, she had hoped Arthur would find peace. She had believed, perhaps foolishly, that Albrook could offer him a quiet life, far from the ambitions and politics of his lineage. She had hoped he would forget about his brothers, just as they had forgotten about this place. But the arrival of Roland had changed everything. In some quiet corner of her heart, she resented him for that. He had reignited Arthur's dreams. Now Arthur stood at the heart of the very world he once tried to escape, learning to lead, to manipulate, and to conquer. All for a trial that would drag him deeper into the struggle he should have despised. She didn't want him caught in the succession battle. She feared that in pursuing it, he would become no different from the nobles he had once stood apart from. But these were thoughts she could never voice aloud. Her role was not to question his path. Her duty was to protect him. That had always been her purpose. She was his maid, and she would help him achieve the goal he had set for himself. He is giving his all. Roland glanced at the sleeping Arthur, his form a small screen within his helmet. While he at first didn't want to include runic cameras into his chambers, they decided to put them in as a safety measure as the possibility of assassination attempts was high. The entire mansion was filled with runic sensors and detectors. At the moment, no assassin had made it through, though several had attempted. Most were Tier 2 killers who never stood a chance. It was clear their enemies were testing defenses, measuring their strength. Despite capturing every intruder, none of them revealed any useful information about who had sent them. Now that Arthur's fame was growing, stronger enemies were likely to appear. Reducing their defensive measures would be foolish. He's on day 3. Mine took 10 when I awakened the Overlord class. I wonder how rare his is. His AI helper Sebastian had analyzed the possible patterns within the trial and Roland had taken the time to record them in a specialized notebook. Yet, the trial had not restarted, and if it was a class of his level, it could take 10 days or more to reset. From an outsider's perspective, the test didn't appear as difficult as the Overlord trial, but he couldn't be sure. Nevertheless, it seemed to be more challenging than what Robert and Lucille had experienced, as theirs had restarted after 3 days for Lucille and a half day later for Robert. Well, the longer the better. I still need time to finish setting up this relay station. Roland stood in what looked like an underground tunnel, though he wasn't truly alone. The walls around him glowed faintly with embedded light runes. They pulsed in a slow rhythm, conserving energy while providing guidance for the workers who would arrive later. He was deep within the dungeon tunnels, continuing his exploration. Thick bundles of black and silver cabling now lined the walls, soon to stretch through the entire network if all went according to plan. While his primary objective was to locate the origin point of the monsters, what they believed to be the super dungeon, there was something else he was searching for. There were several things about this place that bothered him. One of them was how it had remained untouched by human hands and undiscovered until now. The depth below the surface was almost too precise, sitting just beyond the detection range of even the most experienced casters. Not even the highest quality magical tools could have revealed the tunnels, which were saturated with mana. He had only managed to locate them because of the proximity to the second, unfinished dungeon. Still, he suspected that others might have discovered this place as well, and that was something he needed to confirm. That should do it. Once the dwarves arrive, they can dig through and connect it to the city. We will have a secure escape tunnel back to Albrook. For now, he was positioned directly beneath Aldborn. The tunnel leading upward had collapsed, but that would not be a problem for their dwarven miners. In the future, this location could become even more important. They might install an underground train station here, which could help people move across the island more easily. The island still lacked a proper, fully functional railway above ground, and this might serve as the first step toward solving that. Now then, it might be here if my theory is right. He connected the relay station, which resembled a rectangle covered with runes, to one of the main cables that had already been laid out by one of his spider golems. Several of the golems were still working nearby. One of the main units carried a long cable stored inside a compartment in its back, appearing to be attached to a roller. However, the real secret lay within a rune that compressed the entire length of the cable into a compact space using spatial magic. Once unrolled, the cable would be fastened to the tunnel walls by another golem. The walls were dense and highly resistant to drilling, so instead of bolting the cable in place, they had decided to use a specialized adhesive for now. When the dwarven craftsmen arrived, they would reinforce the structure using more refined and permanent techniques. The relay, which resembled a box covered in glowing runes, was placed off to the side and connected to a thick cluster of cables. Once it was active, the signal in the area was significantly boosted, giving him a clear view of everything happening throughout the tunnel system. The first thing that caught his attention was the presence of several mineral pockets, but none appeared valuable enough to justify full-scale mining operations. Still, something else stood out. Something worth investigating. It's not far from here. He turned and walked toward the vehicle he had arrived in. It was not the large armored transport he had previously used to break through waves of monsters. This time, he had chosen something smaller, a sleeker machine that resembled an enhanced version of his runic bike. The third thing that would catch anyone's eye was the set of wide black tires. They were made from the same rubber-like substance used in his other armored vehicle, though shaped into a thinner, more agile form. The design suited underground maneuvering, with its most distinctive feature being the two-tire configuration. The runic bike emitted a quiet, steady buzzing. Its sound was unlike the roar of a combustion engine, more of a low, resonant purr. The frame, forged from dark metal alloys, was entirely black and reinforced with multiple enchantments. As soon as Roland mounted the seat, the runes etched into the frame began to glow with a reddish hue. The machine had an angular design like its four-wheeled predecessor, and it bore thick armor to contain the powerful engine within. Roland swung his leg over the saddle and flicked a small switch beneath the left handle. A ripple of light spread across the bike's frame as it fully activated. The front lights, shaped like pale blue orbs, lit the tunnel ahead with a soft glow. Without making more noise than an electric scooter, he accelerated forward. Guided by the coordinates on his mapping device, he reached the source of the strange readings within moments. A fork. It was exactly that. The path to the left led deeper into Theodore's lands, while the right veered toward another settlement. The tunnels differed in size, with the left being noticeably wider. That made sense, as it was the main route to the central city of the region, while the right path likely served smaller towns. But Roland's interest was not in either direction. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the area between the two tunnels. That was where the strange signals were coming from. He dismounted his bike and walked toward the central point between the diverging paths. His boots clicked softly against the stone floor, each step echoing faintly in the silence. The pale blue lights from his runic machine bathed the area in a cold glow as he began his search. At first, the space seemed unremarkable. Crumbling rocks and disturbed soil covered the ground, suggesting nothing more than natural decay. But after a few minutes of careful inspection, he noticed something unusual. A strange rock formation, dark in color and oddly cylindrical in shape, stood out from the rest. Sebastian! Log this location! He gave the command without hesitation, marking the site as significant. Though the object in his hand appeared ordinary, it supported his growing suspicion. The tunnels might not have been entirely natural. This find could point to deliberate interference, possibly even proof that someone or something had influenced their formation and affected the dungeon. There seems to be a point of entry. He raised his head, following the beam of his bike's lights as they cast their glow upward. With the help of his armor, he rose into the air, slowly hovering toward the ceiling. There, he found what he was looking for. One section of the rock above was noticeably softer, the texture and density different from the surrounding stone. The space was narrow, but just wide enough for a cylindrical object to have been forced through. It must have passed through here a long time ago and remained within. The walls of the tunnel had been solidified by the natural flow of mana and the influence of the dungeon itself. For this specific spot to remain softer than the rest, it could only mean that something had been lodged there for a long period, preventing the dungeon from fully forming around it. Now that the dungeon break had been stopped, the object had likely been damaged or dislodged, either by the sheer chaos of monsters flooding out or perhaps by intentional design. That confirms one, but I'll need to find more to be certain. For now, he turned away from the rubble, the rod-shaped obsidian object held carefully in his gloved hand. It felt cold and inert. The initial readings were weak, offering little insight, but he suspected that with enough samples and proper analysis, especially once he could drill into the core of one, a clearer picture would emerge. Back at the runic bike, a soft pulse of light radiated from one of its side panels. A compartment opened smoothly, revealing a spatial container inside. He placed the object within, and it vanished into storage. Now then, if my theory is correct, I should find more of these at other junctions between major settlements. He folded his arms and waited. The lights on the bike shifted, casting out a projection into the air above him. A detailed map of Dragnus Island appeared, overlaid with the network of underground tunnels he had managed to chart so far. A glowing red dot marked his current location, and his eyes moved across the display to the next promising site, a fork near the main city where Theodore Valerian was stationed. It was a place he intended to investigate thoroughly, both for what it might reveal and for what it could become in the days ahead. As the map flickered and realigned itself, Roland leaned forward and studied the projected routes. He mounted the runic bike again, his fingers gliding across the panel between the handlebars. In addition to the speedometer, the display showed energy levels and included its own tracking and mapping system. The engine hummed quietly to life, and the bike rolled forward into the darkness ahead. These tunnels had not yet been explored by his golems, and their untouched silence pressed in around him. Within seconds, the soft light behind him was swallowed by the pitch-black expanse. Only the glowing rune trail beneath his tires offered a trace of his presence. As he moved deeper, the air became heavier. Dust particles drifted slowly through the beams of his front lights, carried by faint currents. Traces of mana still lingered in the atmosphere, faint but undeniable. This was a place never meant to be seen, yet he pressed on, determined to explore every corner he could before the assembly began. Time was slipping away, as it always did, but he refused to let that stop him. He had to uncover the truth. "Please take a seat, Lord Arthur Valerian." The voice echoed through the chamber. Though it spoke with perfect clarity, something about it felt slightly unnatural. "I was told Sir Roland would be unavailable, but is this construct actually safe?" A woman responded as she stepped forward. Her orange cat ears twitched in discomfort, unsettled by the mechanical tone. "He did assure us it would be fine. I'm sure everything is under control, Mary." 3 figures were present in the memory chamber, though only 2 were humanoid. The first was Lord Arthur Valerian of Albrook. The second was Mary, his maid and personal bodyguard. The third appeared to be a man in a butler's uniform, but his blank synthetic face revealed the truth. He was not human. His name was Sebastian, and he was a golem. "Master Roland is still engaged in his investigation," Sebastian said while standing before the same chair Arthur had used before to take his first trial attempt. "Due to unexpected complications, he has been unable to return. However, I am fully capable of fulfilling his role." "Unexpected complications? Is he fine?" Sebastian's glassy eyes flickered for a moment, processing the question. "Master Roland remains operational and unharmed," the golem answered with mechanical calm, though Mary's eyes narrowed at the phrasing. "Operational?" She wasn't sure how to refer to this being. It looked like a man and spoke like one, but Sebastian was clearly nothing more than a runic construct, not a living being. Still, he behaved in a way that went far beyond what ordinary golems were capable of. It was as if he could reason, as if he truly understood everything they said. Was that the wrong word? "Please forgive me. My empathy and speech modules are still in the beta testing phase. If you would like, I can adjust my voice. Would you prefer something warmer?" No, I think that's fine." Mary shook her head, unsure what the golem meant. As far as she was concerned, it followed orders, and that was all that mattered. Arthur, however, seemed curious. Before she could say anything else, he asked a question. "Oh, you can change your voice? Can you sound like Mary?" "Certainly." Sebastian replied without hesitation. A soft shimmer flickered across his throat as the rune embedded near his vocal area pulsed once. Then, in a voice eerily similar to Mary's, almost perfectly matching her tone, cadence, and even the subtle rhythm of her breathing, he spoke. "Is this more to your liking?" Mary's eyes widened. She stared at Sebastian as if he were a spy pretending to be her. He had managed to imitate a skill typically used only by highly trained infiltrators. The only thing more unsettling would have been if he could also take on her appearance. Arthur, however, let out a tired laugh at the voice change. "That's marvelous. I wonder if Roland could prepare some golems that look like you, Mary. Or maybe one that looks like me." At first, Mary wanted to shake her head and dismiss the idea. But then she paused. It might not be such a bad idea after all. Having a convincing body double might actually help us avoid future assassins. We should bring it up with Sir Roland the next time we see him. I wonder how realistic these golems could become. Arthur had only been joking, but his retainer was already considering the suggestion as a valuable addition to their forces. The idea was genuinely intriguing. Sebastian was capable of performing simple tasks and responding to orders. While the technology was not advanced enough yet, there was potential. In the future, a body double might be able to carry out certain duties without anyone noticing the difference. Other nobles used magical methods to disguise other individuals, altering their appearance, but no one had yet succeeded in creating a golem that could convincingly pass as a real person. Let's add this to our ever-growing list of tasks. For now, I need to face the trial again. Certainly, Lord Arthur Valerian. Please sit down on the chair. Sebastian responded while still mimicking Mary's voice, which made Arthur chuckle again. Just call me Arthur, and you can stop pretending to be Mary. The real one looks like she might be getting irritated. I'm fine, Lord Arthur. Mary replied as if it did not bother her, but deep down, she found it unsettling. Something about the machine using her voice so precisely made her uneasy. Arthur settled into the chair once more, its surface warming slightly under his weight. The runes beneath him flared to life as Sebastian activated them. Just like before, the chair reclined into a horizontal position, and the helmet was placed onto his head. While the memory capture would not be necessary if Arthur succeeded in the trial, it would become invaluable if he failed, especially with the next attempt scheduled for the day of their departure. I am ready. Arthur said quietly, and Sebastian, now speaking in his default voice, responded. Initializing memory capture module. Please begin the ascension trial when you are ready. Around the room, runes began to glow as the systems activated. Screens flickered to life, filling the space with faint light. The helmet on Arthur's head emitted a soft buzzing sound as everything was prepared for recording. Arthur gave a slight nod, tightened his grip on the ascension crystal, and closed his eyes. In an instant, he was pulled back into the ascension space. In an instant, he was no longer in the room. The world melted away, replaced by the dreamscape of the trial. Sebastian turned to the monitor panels in front of him. Runes lit up across the console, forming overlapping circles of light that hovered in the air. Although the trial lasted only a few seconds in the real world, time inside could stretch into months or even years. The longer Arthur remained within the trial, the more promising the outcome. However, if he failed, every critical memory had to be recorded and analyzed to develop an improved strategy for his next attempt. 1 second passed, then another. After about 5 seconds, the panels began to flicker to life. The trial appeared to be over. Arthur's fingers twitched slightly. Splat! A strange-looking creature's head exploded, and violet pus splashed across the stone walls as the runic barrel of Roland's bike-mounted cannon hissed with heat. The monster had barely leapt from the shadows before being torn apart midair by a burst of mana. Screech! 2 more lunged from behind a cluster of rubble, their forms twisted and malformed. Their limbs were sharp like razors, and their eyes glowed with that familiar, corrupt energy. Roland didn't flinch. With a flick of his wrist, his fingers danced across the console embedded between the bike's handlebars. The cannon swiveled into position, guided by the targeting system built into his armor. He watched as the system locked onto the approaching threats. On the panel, each enemy was first outlined by a glowing circle. Once the lock was confirmed, an X appeared over each one. A moment later, the bike's cannons roared to life again. The twin barrels on either side of the bike let out rhythmic pulses of blinding violet light, each shot laced with not only mana but other elemental attributes. The tunnel erupted into chaos as beams tore through flesh and bone, slicing cleanly through the charging monsters with almost surgical precision. But they just kept coming. From the darkness behind the first wave, a small horde emerged, clawed beasts with distorted torsos, fused limbs, and glassy black eyes that reflected nothing but hunger. Some crawled on all fours like spiders, others slithered along the ceiling, sticking to the stone like insects. Their howls filled the tunnel like an orchestra of madness. That's a lot of them. Might be a good time to test that. The deformed monstrosities rushed toward him in a near straight line. The cannons were cutting down a large number of them, but more were closing in from the sides. Even so, Roland did not falter. He stayed on his rune bike and increased his speed, charging straight at them. He tapped through the panel again, and something began to shift. A pointed structure emerged from the sides of the tires. At first, they appeared to be nothing more than a few rods with sharpened ends. Then the runes etched into them began to glow. Light gathered around each one, intensifying until they resembled swords made of pure purple energy. With a sudden burst of resonating energy, the rods extending from the tires snapped into full form, 4 gleaming blades of condensed mana. They spun around with the wheels, turning them into a pair of glowing saws. The edges shimmered with heat and magical power, distorting the air around them. The monsters did not hesitate. Their malformed limbs clawed and scraped against the stone floor as they hurled themselves toward Roland without fear, shrieking and howling, their eyes blazing with unnatural fury. That is, until they slammed into the rune bike barreling straight at them. Shriek! The first wave of abominations was shredded instantly. The energy blades carved through them with savage precision, slicing bone and sinew apart as if they were nothing. One creature tried to leap at him, but the front cannons fired before it could get close, tearing through its body and splitting it into 2 smoldering halves. The remains fell to either side, only to be caught by the spinning blades of light and reduced to even smaller fragments. More creatures dropped from above and crashed into his mana shields. Some tried to cling on, but slid off and fell directly into the spinning blades. Others were gunned down by the front or rear cannons before they could get close. Despite their overwhelming numbers, they could do nothing to stop him. Roland tore through them like a heated knife through butter. Their broken bodies piled up in his wake, yet he continued forward, undisturbed and focused. These must be leftover monsters from the dungeon break. He muttered. But their forms, why are they like this? As Roland pushed through the horde, the creatures' forms continued to trouble him. They were twisted versions of monsters native to the super dungeon, their bodies warped and unnatural. He had tried analyzing them before, but found no clear explanation for the corruption. It almost seemed as though they had been summoned or created in this state by the dungeon itself. Yet something about that theory still felt incomplete. There was a pattern he could not quite grasp. After discovering the strange, dark rods scattered throughout the underground, his suspicion had begun to grow. He was no longer certain the dungeon was acting on its own. Something else, or someone else, might be behind it all. I need to leave one alive. He pushed through the masses of monsters, killing them swiftly until only one remained. It was a massive creature wreathed in flames, with all 4 limbs shaped like sharp blades. Identified as a blazing blade demon. It let out a distorted screech as it stepped out from behind a pile of slain beasts, one of its legs severed by his rune bike. Despite the injury, it kept advancing with a slow limp with no fear in its distorted eyes. Using its front limbs to drag itself ahead, it opened its tooth-filled mouth and released a blazing fireball aimed straight at him. Roland didn't flinch. He let the flames crash harmlessly against the shield of his bike. The barrier held strong, not a single mark left behind. Calmly, he dismounted as if nothing had happened. The creature shrieked louder, as though enraged that its enemy refused to take it seriously. Limb regeneration? That shouldn't be possible. He watched as the creature's severed blade leg slowly reformed, and with it, the demon gained speed. It rushed at him. The monster swung one of its bladed limbs, but it struck only empty space. Roland's form blurred, and in an instant, he was several meters away, just outside the demon's reach. Though it was the perfect moment to strike back, he didn't move. He simply stood there and let the creature attack again. The blazing blade demon screamed with molten fury, its freshly regenerated limbs slicing through the air in wide, lethal arcs. But to Roland, its movements were slow and predictable. A moment later, one of its limbs was sent flying, severed cleanly. The creature was hurled backward by an invisible force as the rest of its limbs were sliced apart in quick succession. You shouldn't be able to regenerate with this special binding spell. The runes etched into his gauntlets began to glow, and the demon was slammed against a nearby wall. The rock, dense and infused with mana, began to shift under his control. Stone flowed like clay, wrapping around the creature's severed limbs and pulling them into the wall. The binding held firm, locking each limb in place. The creature thrashed, but the wall continued to consume it until only its head remained exposed. That was exactly what Roland had been waiting for, and his examination began. Let's see what makes this head tick. He raised one finger, now glowing with blue light, and a blade the size of a scalpel formed at its tip. Slowly, he brought it to the creature's skull and began to slice. Thick, greenish-black blood burst forth. It hissed on contact with the air, poisonous to the touch, but completely useless against the mana veil protecting his runic armor. The creature wailed as its head was cut open. Roland's expression didn't change. His eyes behind his visor, cold and calculating, tracked the incision with the same detached curiosity one might use to dismantle a machine. Piece by piece, he worked his way through the layers of corrupted tissue, cataloging the abnormalities. The flesh is mutated and changed, but I've seen this structure before. What he uncovered beneath the creature's skull was mutated flesh. Twisted and grotesque, yet there was a pattern buried within it, something he had seen before. The demon thrashed violently, but it remained alive just long enough for Roland to cut deeper, driven by the need to confirm his suspicion. Then, just as he neared a breakthrough, a voice echoed inside his helmet. Sebastian was calling him. Master, Arthur's ascension trial has concluded. He was not able to complete it. Arthur. Roland replied, momentarily distracted. Yes. I have updated my guidelines when referring to Arthur. Should I revert to the default designation? No, it's fine. He gave a small nod to himself, focusing on Sebastian's voice. The runes on his helmet flared as he established a link to his runic network. Thanks to the infrastructure his golems had been laying throughout the area, he was now able to connect to Albrook and even access the golemic surveillance within his personal workshop. Through one of the cameras, he saw Arthur rising slowly from the trial chair, rubbing his forehead. His posture was heavy, his expression defeated. The trial had ended, and new images surfaced once the memories were archived. He had failed again, and now only one chance remained before the assembly. One more, hey. Well, this gives me more time to investigate these tunnels. Roland's gaze returned to the bound and twitching creature. Its head had been split open like a lab rat, revealing something unusual inside. From his spatial rune, he retrieved a small vial made of specially treated glass. With a mage hand spell, he carefully extracted the object and placed it into the container for later study. Once it was secured, he sealed the vial within a box inscribed with containment runes. As the lid closed, the runes flared to life, glowing with a dark hue. This should preserve it. It has to be a new strain. With the sample secured, he stepped away from the monster and released the binding spell. Even with his vast reserves of mana, maintaining control over the magically reinforced walls had been a strain. The stones pulled back into place, and the creature collapsed. Its body shriveled in an instant, then burst apart in a sudden explosion of pulpy flesh. Roland stared at the aftermath of his dissection and let out a quiet sigh. It was clear that this investigation would lead to more trouble, both now and in the days to come. But he had no choice. He needed to dig deeper, to uncover the truth. Without knowledge, proper preparation would be impossible. Quiet down. This won't take long. A monster let out a roar as it struggled against the chains of mana binding it. Towering and fearsome, it resembled a lion with bat-like wings and a scorpion's tail. Despite its strength, it was helpless against the iron-clad human methodically carving into its back. Once the task was done, the man retrieved a small vial and removed something embedded near the creature's spine. These samples should be enough. He placed the item into another containment vial, ignoring the monster as it began to die before his eyes. Surrounding it were numerous smaller creatures, ghoulish in appearance. Their bodies emitted dark smoke and pus, which seeped into the corridors and clung to the stagnant air. Roland shook his head at the familiar sight of this phenomenon, known as miasma. There's nowhere for it to go. If I don't purify the area, new monsters could form, even without a dungeon involved. In this world, monsters could emerge in many ways, and miasma was one of the more insidious causes. It was a dark, poisonous fog that flourished in mana-rich environments. If left unchecked, it would give rise to abominations. Although mana levels had dropped in the tunnels after the dungeon break, enough remained to pose a threat. This made Roland's task even more difficult. If he didn't deal with the monster remains now, his golems could be attacked later. Stuck with the busy work again. I really don't have time for this. There were 3 ways to handle the issue. The first was to gather and dispose of all monster remains before they could decompose and release miasma. The second was to purify the area using divine magic. While effective in the short term, this method merely delayed the problem if the bodies remained and eventually broke down. The final solution was to incinerate everything, reducing the remains to nothing and preventing any chance of miasma forming. I'll just collect the better materials. The rest is inconsequential. For now, he chose to combine the first and third methods. He would salvage what was valuable and burn the rest to ash. However, just as he prepared to begin the incineration, a system prompt appeared before him. Congratulations, you have leveled up. Getting closer, but... He paused, eyes narrowing at the notification. His level had increased again. With this, he was just 5 levels away from reaching level 50 in Runesmith Overlord, the midpoint of his main class. This milestone unlocked the option to take on the Ascension Trial. Still, he had no intention of changing classes. Runesmith Overlord granted a powerful stat multiplier, one that suited his build well. Despite the class's raw power, the skills he had been gaining recently felt underwhelming. When he first chose it, he received Overlord's Might, one of his most potent abilities, along with rapid machine reassembly from his previous class, a skill that perfectly complemented his constructs. But over time, the abilities had shifted. They felt more suited for a noble lord like Arthur than for him. The most recent example made that painfully clear. Inspiring speech. Passive skill. The ability to deliver rousing speeches that grant temporary buffs to allies, such as increased strength, speed, or resilience. Talking had never been his strength, and the idea of delivering speeches, especially ones that lasted several minutes or hours, was not appealing. While the buffs provided by the skill could be useful, it did not feel natural to him. He was not a leader in that sense or a motivational figure. He was a craftsman, a strategist, someone who preferred working alone or within a small, trusted group. Now that he was nearing the midpoint of his class, he could only hope the next few skills would be more useful than the recent disappointments. It is not all bad. It has a wide range and can affect even an army of thousands. Still, I have to give a speech first. Public speaking had never come easily to him, and he had no interest in spending time learning how to speak well when Arthur could do it far better. During the Overlord trial, he had realized that he could not handle everything by himself. One of the essential skills for a lord was the ability to rely on resources and vassals effectively. Still, the problem remains. How will I even level up? It feels impossible lately. Although his progress had once been rapid, it had slowed to a frustrating crawl. The recent battle with the giant turtle monster and the waves of lesser creatures had given him some experience, but the system had become increasingly stingy. Tier 2 monsters were now far too weak to provide any meaningful gains. Even defeating a level 150 enemy only earned him a single experience point. Tier 3 monsters were not much better. Unless he stayed within a very specific level range, the experience he gained would continue to drop instead of rise. This was one of the main reasons he had come here, to search for the entrance to the Super Dungeon, a place rumored to hold Tier 4 monsters. If he could locate an area with high enough difficulty, he could finally resume his advancement. He might even be able to construct something similar to the cannon he had used against the Lich, only this time in a more controlled environment. He would make sure nothing gained sentience and spiraled out of control like before. It was time to clean up. After collecting a few useful monster parts, he incinerated the entire area. The spell unleashed a blazing inferno within the tunnel, burning through everything in its path with holy fire. Nothing remained. Even the stale air had been wiped from existence, and all traces of the monsters had been reduced to ash. Time to move on. I don't have much time. Back on his bike, he tossed a sensor toward the wall. It stuck in place, held firm by Rastix's alchemical glue. He was beginning to run low on signal amplifiers and mapping devices. Once they were gone, he wouldn't be able to contact Sebastian in Albrook, even if he tried. His golems were laying down cables behind him, but they moved at a fraction of his speed. Still, he refused to give up. After analyzing the layout of the long tunnels, he had become convinced there was a pattern. Finding the source was only a matter of time. The monsters were growing stronger, and that meant he was getting closer. He had come too far to turn back now. Arthur aimed to achieve a Tier 3 breakthrough before the Grand Assembly. He also had a personal goal, which was to reach level 50 with his current class. Despite lacking an optimized grinding setup, he was confident in his ability to train through conventional means. He could already defeat monsters far above his level, and that gave him the assurance he needed. All that remained was to find the source, then establish a teleportation gate to serve as a gateway to his new training grounds. He continued his journey for another 2 days, venturing deeper into the winding maze of ancient stone and corrupted magic. Monsters still blocked his path, but their numbers began to decrease even as their strength increased. Despite the growing danger, he was certain he was heading in the right direction. The tunnel walls confirmed it. Like the fortified stone around Albrook, these walls had undergone a kind of mana hardening. Over time, the process had made the rock even more resilient, almost as tough as mithril in some places, perhaps even tougher. Even dwarven miners would have struggled to drill through the area he had now reached, which ended at what appeared to be a dead end. This isn't right. He dismounted from his rune bike and checked his map. According to his calculations, this was supposed to be the entrance. The tunnel system followed a specific pattern, expanding outward toward major settlements. By accounting for the cities above ground and comparing them with his current position, which was directly beneath the massive supervolcano at the island's center. The heat was so intense that he had to surround himself with a mana veil reinforced by frost magic. Without it, he would have been cooked alive. Is this really a dead end? The stone in front of him was not ordinary. It looked like solid bedrock, but Roland knew better. While he could not see anything unusual, he felt a presence, something hidden just beyond perception. He had only one skill that could help him reveal the magic at work here, so he activated one of his oldest abilities, the debugging skill. There really is something here. But why runes? The skill was meant to identify flaws in runic structures, but it also had a secondary effect that allowed him to detect and perceive them. These runes had been concealed with extreme care. His usual detection methods and mana sense had completely missed them. What had started as a hunch was now proven true. A hidden locking mechanism was embedded in the stone. Now that he could see the runes, he had a chance to unlock it. The process would not be simple. These runes are incredibly complex. Who could have made this? It was still a mystery he had not solved. The dungeon near Albrook also contained hidden rooms and chambers sealed behind runic locks, but he had never understood how they were placed there. Was there a dungeon architect working from the shadows, or were the dungeon cores intelligent enough to eventually learn how to inscribe runes on their own? He had no answer. What mattered now was getting through the wall in front of him. Time was running short. The heat in the area was starting to affect his rune bike, and he needed to move quickly. Roland placed one hand against the wall, letting his gauntlet's fingers touch one of the hidden traces. Once there, a spider web of mana threads erupted forth and connected with the runic components inside. Now even without his debugging skill active, the magical symbols started to light up as he tried to find the opening mechanism. This one is highly encrypted, this will take a while. Working with macro rune components came easily to him, and modifying them was second nature. However, to gain access in this case, he would need to bypass the internal operating system and convince it that he was its rightful master. Every runesmith and rune mage could encrypt their runes to prevent unauthorized access. It worked like a password that unlocked the path forward, but he did not have that password. This left him with two choices. He could either decode the entire structure by hand or force his way through the locks and hope the system did not collapse. Fortunately, in this world, most people did not implement strong defensive measures in their runic systems. That was likely due to class restrictions. The majority of practitioners were either runesmiths or rune mages. Runesmiths focused on creating and modifying runes on a large, structural scale. Rune mages specialized in interacting with existing runes in more precise and localized ways. But he was different. He possessed the abilities of both classes. He could manipulate the entire system and reshape it at will. Still, the task was far from simple. He was up against what appeared to be a dungeon, something that likely had no class restrictions either. Decoding it would be a challenge. Seconds passed, turning into minutes, and the entire wall in front of him began to light up like a Christmas tree. The section he touched glowed with bright blue mana, while the rest of the structure remained red. Gradually, the runes began to shift to blue as he started to gain control of the system. It took a solid 15 minutes, and by the time it was done, 80% of his mana had been depleted. But eventually, the final rune turned blue. The moment it did, a deep tremor passed through the surrounding tunnel. The stone wall in front of Roland pulsed like a heartbeat. A loud grinding sound followed as the runic seal began to dissolve. A crack formed down the center of the wall, glowing with sapphire light. The air shimmered as a gust of wind blew dust outward. Roland stepped back. It was not because of fear, but because of caution. This was no ordinary dungeon entrance. It appeared to be the starting point of a dungeon break. A horde of monsters could be waiting on the other side, and he had already made preparations in case that was true. Behind him, runes glowed along the walls and ceiling, all set to explode as he escaped through the winding tunnels to safety. Empty. Instead of a wave of creatures, something entirely unexpected greeted him. A soft breeze passed through the opening, carrying the scent of fresh air. Ahead stretched a path of lush green grass, reaching into the distance. It was nothing like what he had expected to find inside a volcanic dungeon. The wind was cool at first, but as it moved past him, it quickly became heated. His rune bike trembled under the sudden rise in temperature, and its mana shield began to flicker. He could sense that the dungeon had its own biosphere. Faint sounds echoed from within, possibly made by animals or monsters. This was the entrance he had been searching for, yet he hesitated. He was not sure if stepping inside was the right decision. I came this far, no use backing off now. He was confident in his skills and had spent a good amount of time researching the super dungeon. He believed he could assess the danger level of the monsters inside with just a few careful observations. However, there was always the risk of stumbling into an unexplored section filled with Tier 4 monstrosities beyond his ability to handle. Time was also a factor. Only 4.5 days remained before their planned departure for the Duke's castle. Fortunately, he carried the resources necessary to construct another small-scale teleportation gate, which he intended to use for his return. Because of the intense heat in the tunnels and the density of the surrounding stone, setting up the gate outside the dungeon would be extremely difficult. That left the interior as the most viable option. Judging by the cool and refreshing air flowing from within, it seemed like the perfect location. It took him a few seconds, but soon the rune bike began to roll forward on its own, crossing the threshold of the dungeon ahead of him. Roland followed slowly on foot. The bike moved across the grass, leaving a faint trail that he used to guide his steps. As soon as his body passed through the entrance, he felt the shift in both mana and temperature. It's well insulated. Crossing into the dungeon felt like stepping into a separate world. None of the outside heat made it through. At first, he considered leaving the entrance open as an escape route. However, after reviewing the runic code embedded in the locking mechanism, he changed his mind. There was a detection program hidden within the structure, something that required a handshake with an external source. If the door remained open too long, it would trigger a response, and he had a strong feeling it would not be a friendly one. As Roland stepped through the dungeon entrance and into the grass-covered passage, a sudden gust of cool, dry air greeted him. This time, it was different. The breeze carried the scent of high altitudes and untamed wilderness. For a brief moment, bright light washed over his face, strong enough to make an ordinary man squint. This was nothing like the volcanic underground dungeon he had expected. Instead, he stood atop a large mountain overlooking a vast valley. His bike came to a stop at the edge of a ledge, and he moved forward to stand beside it. The space before him stretched out endlessly, a breathtaking expanse of untouched beauty, as if it had never been touched by human hands. Suddenly, a shriek pierced the air. Roland looked up to see dozens of monsters that were wyverns. Sleek, powerful, and majestic, their wings shimmered with metallic hues as they soared through the sky. The wyverns circled high above the valley like a living storm, their sharp cries echoing off the mountain walls. This was a far cry from the cramped, dark tunnels he'd battled through so far. This place, will I have to explore it all? He pulled his bike back and hid it inside the mountain tunnel where he had first entered, keeping it out of sight from the monsters. The area stretched far in all directions, and high above him, wyverns circled through the sky. Each one was a Tier 3 creature, well above level 230. These monsters were exactly what he needed to raise his level. At last, he had found a place suitable for training. But before he could begin, he had to find a secure location to set up his teleportation gate. Once that was done, he could finally focus on training. Time was running out, and he needed to hurry. It would probably be unwise to build it here. Roland muttered to himself as he slipped back into the cave he had just emerged from. Wyverns circled overhead, and he had come dangerously close to being spotted. What he needed now was a better location to construct his small-scale travel gate. This area, where the dungeon break had first begun, was far too risky. If another break started here, it could destroy his only means of returning. This space is filled with spatial magic. It could affect the gate enchantments. One of the main reasons he couldn't simply place the gate here, even after drilling into one of the sides, was the overwhelming presence of spatial distortion magic. When he emerged from the cave, he found himself standing on top of a mountain. The entrance he came through was located at the very tip, appearing from the outside like nothing more than a large boulder, no more than 10 meters wide. However, once inside, the passage expanded and extended far beyond what its exterior suggested. What appeared to be a small cave from the outside turned out to be a long tunnel that took nearly 5 minutes to walk through. That distance added up to almost half a kilometer, something impossible without an enormous amount of magic. With so much energy concentrated here, stabilizing the gate would be a challenging task. Using such a gate in this condition would be extremely hazardous. Luckily, the headmistress has given me some flexibility with my lectures, so I have enough time to do what I must. Though his duties at the institute hadn't disappeared, they had eased. There hadn't been any major incidents since his sister stopped attending, and with Arian's help, they had managed to recruit others to assist in organizing the curriculum. His next lecture would be held after their return from Isgard, giving him time to complete his tasks. He also had a few days to attempt 5-level UPS in order to reach level 50, where a potentially valuable skill awaited. It was time to act and begin scouting the area. The large rune bike he had built was not suited for this kind of terrain, so it needed to be stored. Like the elemental armors, it returned to one of his spatial runes, waiting there until it was needed again. With his preparations complete, only one task remained. He needed to switch to a different armor set. This time, it was the Rune Zephyr variant. Fortunately, he was not out in the open but inside a secure cave, which made the process much easier. From here, he could safely equip an element more suitable for stealth, one that would help him move unnoticed through the mountain ranges and the valleys below. After a brief moment of hesitation, he assumed the familiar X-shaped stance, just as he had done when activating the Leviathan variant. The silver-gray suit beneath him shimmered as the armor plates detached with soft hisses, releasing built-up mana pressure. One by one, the base rune armor segments disassembled and vanished into spatial storage. His body glowed with a pale blue light as mana surged across him, then gradually shifted into an emerald green hue as the Zephyr set's elements hovered around him in a slow orbit. The silver-grace underlayer clung tightly to his form, its metallic fibers outlining the contours of his muscular build in the dimly lit cavern. As the light around him turned a vivid green, the armor components began to assemble themselves. The greaves arrived first, locking into place with a clean, resonant snap. They were lighter than anything he had worn before. Next came the bracers, and then, piece by piece, the rest of the armor encased him. He now stood fully equipped in the Rune Zephyr, its greenish glow pulsing faintly with stored elemental energy. Roland took a moment to clench his fist and study the armor now covering his body. It was noticeably sleeker and thinner than any of his previous suits. The wind element enchantments woven throughout the armor were designed for speed, agility, and silence. With them, he could move faster, jump higher, and most importantly, walk almost without a sound. Each step would be nearly inaudible. The armor also enhanced his ability to blend into his surroundings, using subtle camouflage effects that adjusted to the terrain. Even more impressive was the armor's ability to control airflow around him. The wind control field would prevent airborne scent molecules from escaping, making it difficult for scent-reliant creatures to detect him. Many monsters had poor vision and relied on smell or sound, but the wyverns overhead were a different threat. They were more like hawks, relying on sharp eyesight to spot movement from above. Still, the wind field could distort his outline just enough to make him harder to detect, especially with the tall grass and uneven terrain covering the mountains and valleys. With that natural cover and the help of the armor's adaptive enchantments, he had a good chance of going unnoticed. And even if he were spotted, this model would give him a solid advantage. It was the fastest of all the elemental sets he had created, making a swift escape through the air well within reach. Now then, I need to see where I am. But judging by the terrain, this can only be one place. Roland was finally ready to leave the safety of the cave entrance. He stepped forward, but not before placing one of his few remaining sensors near the exit. It would serve as a beacon, ensuring he could always find his way back. This area was far too vast to scatter sensors across it, and he needed to conserve what he had left. His main objective now was to locate a suitable spot to establish a base. From the looks of it, this was one of the zones from the super dungeon, and he had to secure a location where monsters would not venture. However, monsters were not his only concern. This region held far more dangerous beings than just creatures. High-level adventurers roamed these lands, many of them potentially over 100 levels above him. This was the domain not only of Platinum and Mithril-ranked adventurers but also of the super elites, those of Orichalcum rank. Any mistake here could be fatal, so careful planning was essential. If I'm not mistaken, this should be the third ring, the Drachnid Valley. Roland crouched just outside the cave mouth, his Zephyr armor blending seamlessly with the rugged, windswept slope around him. The third ring, known as Drachnid Valley, was infamous not only for its deadly lesser dragon-type monsters but also for being one of the dungeon zones located beneath a massive supervolcano. To the uninformed, the dungeon might have appeared to be a volcanic region filled with lava beasts and dominated by a massive dragon at its center. However, that assumption could not be further from the truth. The Dragnus Island dungeon, also known as the Infernal Wyrm Maze, was composed of multiple interconnected rings. Its name came from the first ring, a maze-like structure filled with lava, ash, and Wyrm-type creatures. For a long time, explorers believed that this fiery labyrinth was the entire dungeon. Eventually, however, it was discovered that it was only the beginning. Beneath and beyond the first layer lay a series of zones, each with its own ecosystem. What began as a realm of fire and molten stone eventually gave way to darker, stranger places. One of these was the Rotten Forest, a twisted and decaying region teeming with poisonous treants and unstable, decomposing terrain. This was the second zone of the dungeon, and it ultimately led into the valley Roland now stood above. This valley, known as Drachnid Valley, was overrun by creatures commonly referred to as lesser dragons. These included monsters such as drakes, wyverns, and Wyrms. Though each of these had the potential to evolve into a true dragon, very few ever succeeded in reaching that final, powerful stage. Most were killed long before they could ascend, whether by rival monsters or adventurers. Their bodies were sought after by almost everyone, but once a dragon was born, most knew to stay away. True dragons were unique among monsters. From birth, they were already classified as Tier 3 creatures. Unlike most monsters that needed to gain strength through battle and experience, true dragons started from a different foundation. They were born powerful, and their growth was not initially tied to levels. Instead, they followed a more natural progression. With enough time and sustenance, they would begin to grow physically and magically. Their development was steady but slow, and during this early phase, they were especially vulnerable. Lacking the immediate benefits of leveling, young dragons were at real risk of being hunted or killed before reaching maturity. Because of this, most naturally born dragons kept themselves hidden. They rarely left their lairs, emerging only for brief periods to gather food before retreating again into hibernation. They waited, conserving energy and avoiding danger, until they could awaken as fully realized true dragons. Once they reached that stage, they became vastly more dangerous. Much like Roland's own Overlord class, their evolution granted them boosts in all areas, with enhanced stat multipliers and superior growth potential. From that point onward, they were no longer just monsters as they became apex predators only challenged by a handful of other powerful beings. The rings surrounding the volcano were vast, said to span a large portion of the island. What made exploration even more difficult was the influence of spatial magic, much like the kind found in the cave he had passed through. These distortions created immense, unnatural distances between areas, making navigation unpredictable and often misleading. From what Roland knew, this region housed monsters that reached up to level 300. It served as a kind of stopgap for many Tier 3 class holders, a place where they either proved their worth or met their end. But Roland had no intention of following in their footsteps. He was different. With his strength, knowledge, and tools, he had already slain monsters well above his current level. Facing stronger creatures was exactly what he had been waiting for. Luckily, in this area, there are no true dragons, but first, I need to find a hideout. At last, Roland began to move. He waited for the right moment. Once the wyverns above turned their attention elsewhere, he slipped forward across the uneven ground. Not far from the cave entrance lay a nest, likely used by the creatures, made of twisted branches and scorched stone. Despite appearing exposed, the entrance he had used was well protected. Anyone who stumbled upon it would find nothing but a short passage ending in solid stone. Based on his analysis, without the ability to decipher the runic enchantments embedded in the rock, the cave would seem no deeper than 5 meters. The real access point, hidden behind layered illusions and spatial wards, remained out of reach to anyone lacking the knowledge to reveal it. Still, Roland had his doubts. From the signs he had encountered deeper within the tunnel system, it was clear that someone else had likely uncovered the connection long before him. Even though his lair could not be built here, he needed to make sure to monitor this area to see if whoever used it would return later. "I'm too exposed here, I need to get down into the valley." The runes on his armor began to glow with an emerald light, and a moment later he was shrouded in a swirling veil of energy. With a slight motion of his foot, he leapt forward and descended from the mountainside. His fall was slow and controlled, guided by the magic of his zephyr armor. Around him, flying wyverns circled in wide arcs, scattered across the sky like drifting shadows. His enchantments made him nearly invisible to their senses, but the spell was not flawless. Any sudden movement could give him away, so he calmly continued his descent. "There is something there. Could it be a settlement? Once I'm back, I need to get my hands on an updated map of this region." As he drifted downward, various landmarks became visible in the distance. Among them was a structure that caught his attention, a keep made from what appeared to be wood and tangled vines. He could not tell whether it was a creation of the dungeon itself or a man-made fortification. This dungeon zone was more than just a place filled with monsters. It was vast, unpredictable, and operated under no particular law. Adventurers had been coming here for years. Some had even chosen to stay. While the regions filled with lava and rot were far too hostile to inhabit, this valley was different. It was filled with vegetation, flowing streams, and breathable air. For some, it served as a rare sanctuary. With enough resources and effort, a hidden stronghold could thrive here. Still, Roland knew he had to be cautious. He was in uncharted territory, and showing himself openly to the locals was risky. Most of the people who lived here were powerful Tier 3 class holders, most above level 200. Some had cut themselves off from the world beyond and did not welcome strangers freely. From what he understood, outsiders typically had to pay or go through a process to be introduced to the permanent residents. These seasoned adventurers offered shelter and security, trading goods and information with the outside world on their own terms. If they discovered that he had bypassed those channels and entered their domain without permission, he could not predict how they would react. His visor gleamed faintly as he began recording the geographical layout of the valley from every angle. 2 of his floating golems circled around him, assisting with the process by scanning and mapping the environment in real time. The distant settlement was only one of many points of interest. The valley held far more than it appeared at first glance. One of the most striking features was the vast blue sky above. At first, it seemed natural, complete with drifting clouds and warm sunlight. However, a deeper analysis revealed the truth. It was nothing more than an elaborate illusion. There was, in fact, a solid rocky ceiling far above, crafted or shaped by magic to appear open and endless. According to his calculations, the distance from the mountain peak to the valley floor was approximately 6 kilometers, with another 4 kilometers extending above that to the false sky. The entire space was immense, stretching in every direction like a hidden world beneath the surface. He was certain it had limits, but those boundaries were not obvious. It would take time and careful exploration to uncover the true extent of the dungeon's reach. As he continued his gentle descent, Roland identified several points of interest scattered throughout the valley. To the northwest, nestled against the inner slope of the valley wall, a shimmering waterfall poured from what appeared to be the open jaws of a dragon or something sculpted to resemble them. The distance was too great to see clearly, but the formation stood out as something unusual and possibly important. Further south, a wide meadow came into view. At its center stood a ring of tall stones. Their shape and spacing looked intentional, not the result of natural erosion or chance. He could see several drakes moving near and around the formation, roaming freely in the open space. These wingless lesser dragons were large and likely powerful, making them excellent targets for leveling when the time came. To the east, he spotted several lakes, but one in particular drew his focus. It was many times larger than the rest, and its water was so dark that it hinted at it being quite deep. For a moment, a massive shadow moved just below the waterline. It shifted slowly, making him question whether it was worth investigating now or leaving it for a time when he had grown stronger. These were just a few of the many sights he saw as he descended. Smaller entrances to various caves dotted the landscape, and dense forests stretched through the valley, with a long river winding through its center. If he hadn't been so tightly constrained by time, he could have imagined himself spending several weeks exploring every part of it. But under the current circumstances, he had to move quickly. That spot looks promising. No monsters, no adventurers, and the mana density is relatively low. As he neared the ground, he spotted a location that could serve as a base for his teleportation gate. The winds around his armor intensified as he activated his mana. Now that he was far from the wyverns, there was no longer any need to remain hidden. He surged forward, transforming into a streak of emerald light, and headed for his next destination. An emerald light descended into a dense patch of forest, hidden deep within a secluded part of the valley. It blended with the green of the foliage and touched down gently, without making a sound. The animals nearby didn't react at first. Only after the mana concealing its true form faded did they notice the man stepping forward. This looks peaceful enough. If there are regular animals here, there can't be many monsters around. Roland had arrived from the mountain top. He stood in a calm and seemingly untouched part of the land. It showed no signs of adventurers or dangerous creatures. He wasn't sure why, but it seemed nothing had any interest in this area. A preliminary scan confirmed it. Few high-level monsters roamed nearby, and there were no signs of adventurers pursuing them. This isn't a good place to hunt monsters, that must be it. That could explain why adventurers stayed away. With no threats and no valuable treasures to be found, there was little reason to come here. The local wildlife was small and unremarkable, consisting of rabbits, frogs, and the occasional lizard. Most dungeon settlements were built in places where larger game, like deer, were available. Some dungeons offered that kind of wildlife, making long-term survival more feasible for human life. But the main reason no one is here. Roland exhaled slowly, drawing in the forest air through the filters in his armor. The runic enchantments detected the hidden particles in the atmosphere and blocked them before they could affect him. There was something in the air, a toxin that did not bother the local animals but would harm any ordinary person who entered this place. It would serve as a natural barrier, a deterrent for anyone who might stumble upon the hidden lair he intended to build. The source of the toxin was the strange and unassuming plants growing nearby. They appeared to be ordinary mushrooms at first glance. Nestled among the undergrowth and close to the trees, they blended perfectly with the forest floor. However, a closer look revealed their true purpose. Roland knelt beside one of the trees and picked one of the mushrooms. Its coloring was peculiar, mostly brown with a few thin blue stripes across the crown. He crushed the mushroom in his gauntlet to test it. As he did, a cloud of spores burst into the air. His armor and a thin layer of mana shielded his body, keeping him safe. A normal person, however, would not be so lucky. Inhaling or ingesting the spores would likely lead to paralysis or even death. I would have to ask Rastix to be sure, but these seem to be spores that cause sleep paralysis. Roland was familiar with several types of spores, and most operated in a similar way. Once a person was affected, the spores would use them as a host. While the victim remained asleep, the spores drained nutrients from the body to grow and eventually spread further. In some cases, the effect was only temporary and could be resisted, but even then, it would leave the victim vulnerable. Any nearby monster would likely attack the moment the spores took hold. Sometimes the hosts were turned into a mushroom-like zombie, losing their humanity. He was not entirely certain which outcome applied to the mushrooms in this area, but he had a strong suspicion. Adventurers probably avoided this part of the valley because of this natural trap, and he could use it to hide his presence. The best spot is probably there. Just as he had done with previous hidden chambers in other dungeons, he planned to conceal this one completely out of sight. In the past, that usually meant breaking through a dungeon wall to create a secret compartment. This time, however, he intended to dig underground. The runes on his armor began to glow as he activated more spatial magic. A moment later, several of his golems appeared. These were not his usual golems. Instead, they were repurposed ones he had acquired from the dungeon. They had humanoid forms and carried tools like shovels and pickaxes rather than weapons such as spears or swords. Some even pushed wheelbarrows to move the sand. He had assembled an entire construction crew equipped with ordinary tools, and their task was to dig a large enough hole to create something similar to an underground bomb shelter. Once summoned, the golems immediately began their work. They had been pre-programmed with a specific design for the underground structure. There were not many design options available, so their job was to excavate the exact layout, then assemble and weld the metal components using magic. This magical welding would prevent the dungeon from sealing itself back over the structure. After everything was prepared and he had established a noise-cancelling barrier, the real work began. The shovel-wielding golems moved in first. Their enhanced strength and oversized shovels allowed them to function much like modern excavators. As dirt was unearthed, it was transferred to the side and deposited into a specialized container marked with spatial runes. In most dungeons, debris and surface flaws would eventually be erased or absorbed, but this super dungeon operated on such a massive scale that those effects were largely reduced. To avoid leaving traces of the excavation, he needed to remove all excess soil so as not to give away his safe spot. For a moment, he watched the golems move about their tasks and estimated that, at their current pace, it would take roughly an hour to complete the small underground chamber for his teleportation gate. While they worked, he sent his floating golems to different positions around the area. Through their eyes, he gained a clear aerial view of the surrounding land and could spot the tiny figures representing the monsters roaming nearby. Is it a WIRM, and is it coming this way? Most of the creatures were simply wandering, but one larger figure appeared to be heading directly toward him. Monsters within dungeons usually followed predictable movement patterns, and it was possible he had chosen a spot that intersected one of those paths. If that were the case, he would be forced into a fight before the construction was complete. Roland wanted to stay hidden for now, as he still didn't fully understand the situation within this dungeon ring. However, he had to deal with the approaching threat before it reached his golems, which were ill-suited for battle. The WIRM was slithering straight toward him, so it made more sense to intercept it and prepare some countermeasures. He soon rose into the air, using wind magic instead of a propulsion unit. Although a propulsion system was faster and placed less strain on his mana reserves, it created more noise and left a visible trail. Wind magic, on the other hand, allowed him to remain far more concealed from sight. After landing in a denser part of the forest, he began preparing his trap. Before doing anything else, he brought out a circular device. With a press of a button on its side, he quickly hid it inside the trunk of a nearby tree. Once secured, it released an invisible burst of energy in all directions. To the naked eye, nothing seemed to happen, but from that moment on, sound would no longer travel beyond the affected area. To any monsters outside the zone, the forest would appear silent and undisturbed. With the sound barrier in place, he started setting traps throughout the area. Some were his old scroll-based types, while others were leftover bombs and mines, which he buried under loose dirt with the help of his mage hand spell. These precautions might have seemed excessive given his current strength, but conserving mana was essential in this environment. It was wiser to rely on pre-prepared tools first. For all he knew, killing the monster might attract more, or worse, alert high-level adventurers. If anyone close to or beyond Tier 4 took notice of him, he would need every bit of mana and every resource he had just to escape. That should be enough. The monster was in no hurry, but once it began to move, it was easy to track. The trees along its path shifted and bent, straining under the force of its massive body. Although it slithered around the trees like a snake, every time it bumped into a trunk, the tree was nearly uprooted. Birds and other forest creatures fled in every direction, and soon, a pair of yellow eyes appeared in the distance. So this is a WIRM. It was Roland's first time seeing such a creature, and it was immediately clear that this was no ordinary serpent. What emerged from the treeline was enormous. Although its movement mimicked that of a snake, there was something more to it. The WIRM had a snake-like form, but the similarity ended with its shape. Thick, draconic scales ran down its entire length, overlapping perfectly in rows that shimmered slightly in the filtered forest light. Each scale was the size of a grown man's fist and bore deep grooves and ridges. Their dark, purple-gray color blended well with the valley's shadows, but in motion, they reflected just enough light to make the creature visible. Along its back, two wings extended outward. They were draconic in shape but clearly too small to lift such a massive body into the air. Rigid and sharp-edged, the wings had a membrane-thin structure with claws at each joint. They did not move or retract, instead clinging tightly to the serpent-like body as it slithered toward the area where Roland had prepared his traps. Its head was unmistakably dragon-like. Unlike a serpent's narrow snout, the WIRM's face was broad and angular. Horns curved backward from above its eye ridges, and its jaw was thick, with rows of pointy teeth barely visible beneath a heavy lip. Venomous Forest WIRML 225. With a quick identification spell, Roland confirmed it. This was the right place for leveling. The monster's level exceeded his own, which meant it would yield a large amount of experience. He readied himself as the creature approached the outer edge of the trap field, but then, out of nowhere, the monster did something unexpected. Just as it was about to trigger the first mine, the WIRM stopped. Its nostrils flared, drawing in the air with a hiss, while its breath released thin gusts of purplish smoke. A low growl rumbled from its chest as it paused, its forked tongue flicking out, as if testing the air for any sign of danger. Can it tell? Roland knew that draconic creatures were said to be far more intelligent than ordinary beasts, but he had assumed that those created by the dungeon would be less capable. Somehow, this one had sensed the presence of traps ahead. It was possible that it could detect the faint traces of mana emitted by his runic devices, subtle as they were. The monster let out a roar, as if irritated by the blocked path ahead. It opened its massive jaws, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. Then, without hesitation, the WIRM released its breath. A surge of violet energy gathered deep in its throat before erupting into a torrent of unnatural flame. This was no ordinary fire. Roland had read about it in obscure bestiaries, but witnessing it firsthand was something entirely different. The flames were a seething, toxic purple, thick with venomous fumes and corrosive energy. They didn't simply burn, they melted everything they touched, dissolving trees, soil, and stone in a wave of acidic destruction. The first of Roland's mines didn't even have a chance to detonate. As the WIRM's breath swept over them, the enchanted casings began to melt and dissolve with alarming speed. Metal turned to sludge, and the runic components failed to activate as their pathways were broken and consumed in an instant. What remained was a trail of ruin, a scorched path the WIRM now considered safe to travel, having cleared it of all hidden threats. Yet, for all its perception, the creature still failed to detect its true enemy. Roland remained concealed above, hidden among the branches of an undamaged treetop, silently watching and waiting. He didn't move. Not yet. From his vantage point above, hidden by both the dense canopy and a layer of illusion magic, Roland carefully observed the WIRM's movements. The creature slithered forward, seemingly convinced that it had neutralized any threats in its path. Despite its intelligence, it was now moving directly beneath him. Its massive body even brushed against the trunk of the tree he was hiding in. It's cautious, but it still has its limitations. His visor pulsed with a brief glow, and in the next instant, concentrated beams of light shot out from various positions around the clearing. They struck the WIRM's thick scales, doing little damage but forcing it to turn away from his location. Roland's floating golems emerged from their hiding places, coordinating in a precise assault designed to draw the monster's attention. The WIRM let out a furious roar and unleashed its breath once again. A wave of violet mist surged forward, but the small, agile constructs darted to the sides with ease. The toxic breath melted through a massive boulder and tore through several trees. It left scorched earth and liquefied debris in its wake. Now fully engaged in chasing down the elusive golems, the WIRM was distracted. This finally gave Roland the perfect opportunity to strike. Gale forces erupted as he revealed himself, in his hands a large hammer with a tip covered in runes, radiating a massive amount of energy. Without hesitation, he dove from the treetop like a meteor, wind mana coiling around his body in thick, spiraling streams. The emerald glow intensified, pulsing erratically as it gathered at the head of his massive hammer. Then, just before the weapon struck the WIRM's skull, a second energy flared to life, this one a deep crimson. The two forces clashed and intertwined, forming a chaotic burst of yellow light that surged around the hammer. In the next instant, the weapon crashed into the monster's cranium with more than just wind force. Crash! The hammer struck the monster's head with a thunderous crack that was concealed within the sound bubble. The force of the impact sent shockwaves rippling through the ground. The ground beneath the WIRM buckled and split, and trees nearby swayed violently. The creature's massive head snapped to the side, and a scream of agony escaped from its massive jaws. Even with its thick, scaled skull, the WIRM could not withstand the sheer force of the blow. The combination of aura and magic bypassed its natural defenses. Fractures spread across its cranium like spiderwebs, and in the next moment, its body slammed into the earth. The forest fell silent. One strike had been enough. The WIRM lay motionless, killed by the surprised attack. That went better than expected. Roland glanced at his status screen and checked his experience bar. The monster had been 5 levels above him, and after its defeat, the bar jumped up by nearly half in an instant. This was exactly what he needed. The creatures in this dungeon were stronger and possessed rarer evolutions, making them ideal targets for accelerating his progress. With this test complete, one thing was clear. Gaining 5 more levels was no longer a distant dream. To make things even better, the monster's body held plenty of value. Roland approached the fallen creature and grabbed hold of one of the partially shattered scales. Even with his enhanced strength, it was difficult to pry loose, but after a few moments of effort, it finally snapped free. The scale felt like solid metal, denser and harder than most materials he had worked with, incomparable even to mithril. He did not doubt that some lesser dragons had evolved to possess defenses tougher than the metals he used in his constructs. These scales could be repurposed for future upgrades. If he found a more advanced draconid, he might even be able to craft an entirely new suit of armor. I would need one that is over level 250. Even though he had the funds, materials like these were rare and difficult to acquire. His thoughts drifted to the large drakes he had seen while landing, as well as the hidden leviathan resting in the lake. One of the drakes was larger than the others, likely the alpha of the herd. Both were potential targets for the future and could serve as direct upgrades to his armor and weaponry. He would need those improvements soon. His future was still uncertain, and he would not rest until he had explored the entire region and claimed every valuable resource it could offer in support of his cause. This is quite a large mana stone. I should be able to make ether mithril with this, or maybe I should save it for something better. Roland used a sharp knife to sever the monster's flesh. The blade buzzed with energy, enhanced by a cutting enchantment. Although the exterior shell was covered in thick scales, once he opened a wound, it wasn't too difficult to peel away the layer of skin beneath. There, nestled inside, he found a large mana crystal about the size of a fist. Reminds me of the good old days. Back when he first started exploring the Albrook dungeon, one of his earliest methods involved implanting mana stones directly into his older sets of armor. As his knowledge grew, he learned more advanced techniques and began infusing mana stones into the metals themselves. This let him benefit from the stones without the risk of them shattering in the middle of a fight. It was much more difficult to merge stones into higher-grade metals like mithril. That process demanded superior quality stones, which couldn't be found in the Albrook dungeon. Most undead monsters lacked them entirely, relying instead on their monster cores to hold themselves together. The process was expensive and inefficient, but now things could change. He had stumbled into an area teeming with high-level draconic creatures that actually carried the stones he needed. Judging by this WIRM's crystal, there were likely more just like it. 3 incoming? Did I kill their leader or something? The drones hovering in the sky picked up signs of movement. His mapping device also showed several dots moving in his direction. Even though he had surrounded the area with a silencing barrier, these creatures somehow knew he was here. He would figure out how that was possible later. For now, he needed to prepare for a fight. Roland's eyes narrowed as he studied the small screen inside his helmet. One of his floating golems was feeding him a live video feed. The monsters approaching looked like the same type as the one he had just killed, though smaller and a few levels lower. From what he could tell, this species seemed to grow in size with each level gained. If that was true, then at level 250, they probably reached twice the size of the creature he had just faced. Venomous Forest WIRML 213. Venomous Forest WIRML 214. Venomous Forest WIRML 211. They were all weaker, but that did not mean he could afford to ignore them. Previously, he had combined aura with wind energy to bring down the monster more quickly. This strategy consumed a large amount of mana, but it still allowed him to retain both Overlord's might and mana overflow for when the fight became more intense. Fortunately, his mana was already recovering at a fast pace, and even if it had not been, he still had a supply of recovery items to rely on. His analysis of the species was ongoing. So far, he had learned that they seemed to possess some kind of sixth sense that allowed them to detect traps and lurking threats. However, they had one big weakness: their inability to fly. He, on the other hand, could. Roland's wind-focused armor began to glow as he gently lifted into the air. The suit had been designed for speed and aerial agility. Even without the additional flight unit he sometimes used as a jetpack or the large glider platform, the armor alone allowed him to maneuver through the skies with ease. As he rose higher, the armor began to shift. Small openings appeared across its surface, releasing pulses of concentrated wind magic. The largest vents were located on the soles of his boots and along his back. These channels expelled directed gusts of air, functioning much like a refined form of jet propulsion. Guided by wind magic, Roland could ride and redirect air currents just like certain massive creatures that seemed far too heavy for flight, yet still soared through the sky with grace. The wind whispered around Roland as he gained altitude, but he was careful not to stray too far. The wyverns he had avoided gathered near the mountain tops, but that did not mean none were lingering near this area. He needed to maintain a careful balance to avoid attracting the attention of any new monsters that might spot him hovering above the forest. Below, the forest trembled before the advance of the three lesser wyverns. Though only slightly more than half the size of the one he had already slain, they were still Tier 3 creatures. Their purple-grey scales shimmered under the illusion of afternoon light, and their slit-pupilled eyes glowed faintly with malice. They're going for the carcass of the larger one. He noticed that the monsters were not acting in coordination. Instead, they seemed drawn to the remains of the dead wyrm he had carved apart. Roland could not tell whether they were attracted to the blood or to the large mana stone he had retrieved. Somehow, they perceived something was still there despite his protective measures. Was this a special ability unique to wyrms, or was it shared by all lesser dragons? If the latter was true, then hunting them would become far more difficult. At first, he planned to attack but chose instead to wait and prepare his weapon. The hammer he had used before unfolded and shifted into a runic staff. Wind energy gathered around him once more, cloaking him from sight as he studied the strange behavior of the monsters below. He had read something about this dungeon and others like it, and before making a move, he wanted to confirm a theory. Roland remained still, floating high above the treetops like a silent spectre. The runes on his armor subtly adjusted, channeling the wind to keep him aloft. Below him, three wyrms slithered towards the corpse of their fallen kin. They moved quickly toward the clearing where he had placed the body, entirely fixated on it for reasons that were not immediately clear. The creatures seemed to be fighting over something. Two of them bumped into each other, hissing and snapping their jaws. This distraction gave the third wyrm a chance to reach the corpse first. It became clear to Roland what they were after, the large mana stone he had extracted. The creature sniffed the spot where the stone had been and appeared to grow increasingly frenzied at the realization that it was missing. These monsters were not acting like the usual dungeon inhabitants. They behaved more like independent beings. Unlike the mindless creatures he had faced in other dungeons, which resembled golems in their mechanical behavior, these showed signs of thought and instinct. Natural-born monsters consumed mana stones and monster cores to evolve more effectively and gain experience. These three were doing just that. They were not bound by the will of the dungeon, and they even seemed capable of fighting each other. Something that perhaps he could use to his advantage. The mana stone he had taken was safely hidden in one of his spatial runes, but he retrieved it again. As soon as it appeared, the monsters reacted. They began scanning their surroundings, clearly sensing the stone's mana signature. Fortunately, his concealment spells were working well enough. The creatures knew the item was nearby, but they could not locate it precisely. While they searched, Roland devised a plan. He summoned one of his floating golems. He attached the mana stone to the golem, using the same adhesive he had previously employed for placing sensors in the tunnels. Once it was on tightly, the golem was commanded to fly around the clearing. As soon as the golem moved beyond the reach of his concealment magic, the monsters snapped their heads upward. Their nostrils flared, releasing acidic breath, and drool began to drip from their mouths. All three immediately gave chase, focused entirely on the golem and not on whoever had sent it. This gave Roland a perfect opportunity to move closer and wait for the right moment to strike. He was not here to engage in prolonged combat just yet. His priority was to buy time until his golems finished preparing his temporary hiding place, and to make sure that it was safe to place his teleportation gate there. Just as he had expected, the three monsters chased after his golem like cats chasing a wiggling toy. It darted through the air in unpredictable patterns, neatly avoiding their attacks. Though the monsters were powerful, they lacked range beyond their acidic breath. The deadly attack used by the earlier creature was dangerous, but it clearly couldn't be unleashed as frequently as standard dragon fire. Meanwhile, the golem was doing an excellent job of provoking the trio into wasting their limited stamina and abilities. That should be enough. The barrier is set up, all preparations have been made, nothing should get through this time around. Once he was confident that they had exhausted a good portion of their energy, he began his assault. Activating his mana overflow skill, the green aura surrounding him shifted to a bright cyan. With a sharp release of concentrated wind energy, a cyclone surged toward the three monsters, who had now surrounded the golem. To them, it appeared trapped, but Roland had placed it there on purpose. It was never more than bait. From high above, Roland extended his arm and raised his staff, unleashing a powerful spell. A colossal twister of green energy roared to life, spiraling downward like a divine spear. It struck the clearing where the three wyrms had gathered, expanding with violent force as it touched the ground. The cyclone grew rapidly, wide enough to engulf all three monsters as well as his golem. The octagonal construct had fulfilled its purpose and was consumed by the swirling magic, torn apart into thin pieces. Even the mana stone it had carried was shredded by the raging energy along with the golem itself. The WIRMS had no idea what had struck them. While they were not particularly susceptible to wind magic, the sheer force of Roland's spell overwhelmed even their thick, scaly hides. The magic began to tear into them, and although they resisted and tried to escape the growing storm, the effort was in vain. As they pushed outward in desperation, the winds dragged them back toward the center with relentless force. Above the storm, the air rippled as the winds collided with the barrier he had created. His floating golems hovered in specific positions, forming a protective magical field. Not only was the barrier completely invisible to the naked eye, it also cast an illusion to conceal the battle below. After analyzing the behavior of the monsters, he ensured that not even a trace of mana leaked from within. It appeared to be working. No other creatures had taken notice of the location, and the WIRMS trapped inside the Emerald Cyclone were being sliced apart. I can use their behavioral patterns to my advantage. Once the task was complete, Roland descended into the heart of the cyclone. All that remained were the shredded remains of the serpentine monsters. Not even their draconic heads had been spared, and with enough magic, even their scales had been cut clean through. Now that he understood how these enemies responded, he could envision isolating one of the stronger beasts and drawing the smaller ones into an area of effects spell. The only drawback was the lack of experience points. To earn the highest amount, it was best to avoid fighting enemies more than 10 levels below his own and to target those above his current level instead. These creatures still gave him a decent amount of experience and were worth farming, as long as he could lure them into a trap to make the fight easier. His testing wasn't finished yet. Normally, he would dispose of the monster remains, since he had learned that the local creatures were attracted to them. However, if he removed the important parts such as mana stones, and perhaps the lesser dragon hearts, eyes, and fangs, then neither creatures nor adventurers would bother with what was left. After taking what he needed, he waited to see how the dungeon would react to a defeated monster's body. At first, he wondered if it would surprise him again by leaving the remains to decay naturally. But not everything had changed. After about 30 minutes, the remains began to sink slowly into the ground. The process was gradual but familiar. The dungeon was absorbing the corpse, likely recycling its materials for future use. This was still a dungeon, and this was proof of it. It would be enough for the first scouting mission and initial battle. As he waited, a beep echoed inside his helmet, signaling that his golems had finished assembling the temporary lair. The floating golems were recalled, and soon he flew back to the area where he had first arrived. The spores were still drifting through the air, but to him and the golems, they posed no real threat. Instead, they were quite a good deterrent for monsters and adventurers. Once he landed, he saw his golems crawling out of a hole and placing a thick cover over it. The design he had in mind resembled an old bomb shelter with a direct descent underground. As with other dungeons, he expected the soil to eventually conceal the entrance, though he had other methods of hiding it as well. After activating his spatial storage, a hammer appeared in his hand. He hadn't been certain how to enchant the entrance before, but now he knew exactly what to do. The golems positioned themselves around the area to muffle the noise and block the sparks that started flying. He began striking the lid and the surrounding metal that the golems had already installed. His runes appeared quickly as he filled in empty spaces and connected them to the existing rune-crafted traces. It didn't take him long to move into the shelter, which was little more than a rectangular space with a square floor about 10 meters wide. The ceiling rose roughly 3 meters above, and in the center was the circular entrance he had used to come in. There was no need for a ladder since he could float, and he had no intention of bringing anyone else here anytime soon. The surrounding areas were dangerous, and he planned to explore all of them, including the nearby settlement where people were living. He feared those people more than the monsters, as they were far harder to predict. Now then, let's get it all set up. Once the rune crafting process was complete, he allowed a single orb of light to illuminate the room. The lid was closed, and all the humanoid golem workers were retrieved. He, however, moved toward one of the thicker walls that was already imbued with functioning runes and specifically, spatial runes. To the average observer, it would have looked like witchcraft. He simply held out his hand, and from within a thin layer of space, items began to appear. Despite the illusion, there was a system behind it. Every item he placed in the spatial storage carried its own unique mana pattern. When he activated the runes that opened the storage, he could sense the location of each item inside. With a simple mage hand spell, he could draw out whatever he needed. The gravity within the magical storage was also weaker, so everything inside felt significantly lighter. Soon, he gathered all the necessary components for the minimalist teleportation gate. It stood 2 meters tall, 1 meter wide, and was shaped like an oval. While teleportation gates were typically circular, it was possible to limit their size. For now, this was the smallest configuration he could manage without causing issues. Further reducing the runes would lead to instability. Time passed, and the setup was finally complete. On the left side of the gate stood a large canister filled with mana fluid. On the right was a rectangular storage unit with several openings designed to hold smaller rune batteries. He had deliberately prepared 2 separate energy sources. Once he left the dungeon, he needed to ensure that it would not draw power from the gate, which remained a real possibility. To prevent any potential issues, he also brought a smaller version of the console that he kept in his workshop. While it couldn't be linked to the main unit or operated by Sebastian, it still offered several useful features. One of them allowed him to monitor the area outside the dungeon. If a monster attacked or another problem occurred, the device would send out a distress signal that could be picked up by one of the sensors he had left near the secret entrance he used to reach this location. That should do it. Should I head home now? Roland felt satisfied. He had accomplished everything he set out to do. If he left now, he would be back in time for dinner. However, just as he was about to activate the teleportation gate, the console lit up red. Something was approaching, and it did not appear to be a lesser dragon or any other monster. Get a move on. A loud man kicked another, sending him stumbling forward. He crashed into a nearby tree, then was yanked back and shoved ahead again. No, please, you don't have to do this. Just let me go. The man staggered forward, his face covered in bruises and his clothes torn apart. The one who had kicked him scowled at the plea and pointed ahead as he spoke. Shut it. Do you think we're stupid? You think we'd risk you running off to report this to the guild? As soon as he finished shouting, another man with them began to laugh. This one was much larger, his face bearing a faint resemblance to an orc, though he spoke clearly. Yeah, just keep walking. Don't worry, you won't feel much once the spores paralyze you. Or at least, that's what I've heard. Oh, and don't worry. We'll take good care of your wife and daughter. The second man spoke as he continued pushing the injured prisoner forward. The bruised man stumbled again, barely able to stay upright as he approached the mushroom-infested section of the valley forest. The air became thicker, laced with glistening spore particles that became visible only when the light caught them just right. Once the group reached the edge, the 2 men halted. Without hesitation, they hurled the injured man forward and quickly stepped back, and then wrapped thick cloth around their mouths. And no. The man rolled across the ground from the force of the throw. Although he was not small by any means, they had tossed him as if he weighed nothing. Their strength clearly surpassed his, which did not surprise the person watching them from within his newly created lair. If they want to kill someone, why go to so much trouble? He doesn't even have a battle class. Nestled in the branches of a nearby tree was a strange object shaped like an octagon, with an orb embedded at its center. It was one of Roland's floating drones, hidden among the foliage, invisible to all but the most perceptive eyes. These drones acted as a silent surveillance network and quietly monitored the area. Roland had planned to return home, but now he found himself observing an unusual scene. A defenseless man was being paralyzed by the spores Roland had previously observed. The 2 Tier 3 warriors who had brought him here were now watching from a safe distance, uninterested in what came next. Was he just a temporary worker they brought along? Did he break some rules or insult someone important? Roland had not intended to investigate the human settlement he had seen in the distance, at least, not yet. The region was crawling with dangerous creatures and even deadlier adventurers, any of whom could prove a threat even to someone like him. His level was respectable, but not high enough to take unnecessary risks. While he was confident that his armor and tactics could allow him to defeat opponents with higher levels, he knew he wasn't invincible. He planned to gain strength quietly and only reveal himself when he was certain that no one in the area could pose a real threat. He didn't fully understand the power structure in this region, but he had studied many reports before arriving. The area was ruled by adventurers, functioning almost like a small independent nation. Even nobility hesitated to venture too deep into the dungeon without the backing of an army and several high-level adventurers. Down here, strength dictated authority. Even if a high-ranking noble were to disappear, it was unlikely anyone would report it. These adventurers create their own factions down here. It seems this guy angered the wrong person, but what should I do about it? He analyzed the man's class and quickly saw that he was nothing more than a blacksmith. While a place like this dungeon would normally be deadly for people without combat classes, some still chose to live here because the pay was good. They stayed in forts and settlements, working directly under the adventurers. Earlier, the conversation had involved the guild, so Roland assumed this blacksmith had been assigned by the Adventurers Guild to work here. Supposedly, he had even brought his whole family with him, which made things more complicated. As Roland considered the situation, the man suddenly collapsed in the middle of the area where Roland had set up his hidden hideout. The two adventurers who had brought him here started to leave the moment they saw him inhale the spores and begin to show signs of paralysis. Then things became even more interesting as something awoke within the forest. A creature that had previously hidden its presence was starting to reveal itself. So it only reacts when someone gets paralyzed. Greenish tentacles began to slither toward the man who had collapsed. Roland had previously identified something that looked like a flesh-eating plant in the area but had decided to leave it alone. He thought it was better to let it remain as a deterrent to others. However, it now seemed the adventurers living here had been using it to get rid of people they had conflicts with, which made the location of his lair more problematic than he had anticipated. Do they do these things often? He asked himself as his wind-attuned armor began to lift away from his body, replaced by a red suit. Rune Salamander encased him, transforming his appearance into something more suited to the Valley of Draconids, creatures often referred to as lesser dragons. While many of them had strong resistance to flames, plant-based monsters like the one trying to eat the blacksmith were a different matter. There was nothing better than a good flamethrower in a situation like this, and Roland had no intention of letting a man die in front of him, even if it complicated his plans. In a way, this might have even turned out to be a useful opportunity. The man likely had valuable information about the valley, especially if he had been living here for some time and understood the local power structure. Roland rose through the circular opening after confirming the perimeter was secure. With a precise arrangement of his golems, he activated the concealment field to shield himself from the two outsiders. The last thing he needed was for those men to come back snooping. They weren't a threat to him, but if they went missing as well, the situation would become even more complicated than it already was. As he stepped outside, the lingering spores burned away under the heat of his armor's flame aura. There, he spotted the blacksmith, now entangled in fibrous vines that oozed a strange green mucus. The monstrous plant had begun to reveal its full form. It vaguely resembled a flytrap, its gaping maw filled with some kind of liquid. Does it dissolve its prey with that? Roland moved quickly to help the man. Inside the liquid, he could see the bones of other humans floating alongside the remains of smaller animals. It was clear the creature used the spores to lure victims in, then dissolved them slowly, a death that was likely excruciating. The man was paralyzed, but his senses were still active, and he would feel every moment of it until the very end. His hand pointed toward the monster, and a surge of flames erupted. The moment the fire collided with the creature, it ignited instantly. Whatever mucus or liquid it had been using was highly flammable, and the resulting explosion lit up the entire area. The blacksmith's eyes widened at the sight, but before the flames could reach him, an invisible force pulled him back. A shimmering blue shield appeared around him, protecting him from harm. The monstrous plant didn't scream, but it thrashed violently, its tentacle-like appendages flailing in every direction. They struck only the magical barrier, which began to glow crimson from the heat. The surrounding flames intensified, and within half a minute, the creature was dead. That about does it. Roland used his magic to contain the flames and smoke, keeping the destruction from spreading. Only then did the golems deactivate the protective shield. He glanced down at the man, who was still paralyzed but conscious. His eyes moved, showing awareness and fear. Roland raised a finger, and his glove emitted a soft glow as he cast a spell. The man's eyes began to flutter, then slowly closed. Sleep for now. Roland said quietly, then summoned his mage hand spell and gently lifted the man from the ground. After burning away any lingering spores and checking for hazardous substances, he opened the hatch to his shelter. The man floated down into the opening, and Roland followed close behind. Once they were inside, the hatch sealed shut behind them. Moments later, the earth shifted, covering the entrance even more thoroughly to ensure it remained hidden from view. After glancing at the console and confirming there were no further interruptions, he activated the miniature teleportation gate. The runes on the oval surface lit up, pulsing in sequence as the gate powered on. The air inside began to shimmer, gradually forming a silvery blue portal that looked like thick, flowing liquid. Destination confirmed. Calibration complete. He murmured to himself and cast one final glance around the hastily assembled shelter. For now, it was holding steady. He saw no signs that the dungeon was pressing in too tightly. With a subtle wave of his hand, he sent the blacksmith through the gate first. The man's limp body disappeared into the light with a soft ripple. A moment later, he stepped in after him. There was no sound, no change in pressure, only an instant shift in surroundings. He emerged in the center of his workshop. The teleportation chamber and the larger gate within stood in stark contrast to the damp valley he had just left. The unconscious blacksmith now rested gently in Sebastian's arms. His new humanoid body was pale and marble-like, giving it an uncanny appearance. His clothes resembled a professional butler's uniform, something Lucille had arranged. "Welcome back, Master." Sebastian's voice sounded more natural now, not as robotic as Lucille wished to make him as human as possible, but to him it didn't matter much. His eyes moved around to keep eye contact for a moment, and then lowered themselves to the man he was holding in his hand. "What shall I do with this gentleman, Master?" "Call Mary and have one of her maids transport him to a holding cell, tell her that he can't find out where he is and who we are. He will be asleep for an hour at most, so hurry." "As you wish, Master." Roland gave the order and stepped out of the teleportation chamber, shaking his head. He had planned to enjoy a quiet dinner with his wife before returning to the dungeon, but now he would have to deal with this man instead. Even though he had rescued him, he couldn't reveal where they were or why the man had been in the dungeon. The stranger couldn't be trusted with their secrets, so it was safer to let him believe he was just an unknown adventurer who had somehow teleported out on his own. Once they finished gathering information from him, Roland intended to discreetly bring him back to Isgard, where the main entrance to the dungeon was located. There, the man could report what had happened to the guild and let them take over from there. Roland had no desire to involve himself any further, though he would wait to hear the full story before making a final decision. Sebastian went to work quickly and informed Mary about everything through the workshop's communication system. He had a direct line set up with Arthur's estate, and within minutes, 2 masked maids were already rushing through the underground tunnels to retrieve the man from his workshop. Everyone seemed occupied. Arthur was making his final attempt at the Ascension trial before their planned departure, while he was focused on gaining a few more levels and acquiring a new skill. The only thing keeping him grounded was his wife, and he decided to spend some time with her. He removed his armor, the parts separating and settling onto special racks where they would remain until his return. "Oh, you actually made it back in time for once." Her voice greeted him with a touch of sarcasm, but he just smiled. He walked up behind her and gave her a gentle hug. She tried to squirm away as she was still busy cooking. "Hey, stop. Go play with Agni. I need to finish this first." She waved her ladle at him in mock warning, and he backed off with a grin. Outside, not much had changed. Agni came running up and immediately tried to lick his face. Bernier was still at work, skillfully handling his tools with his prosthetic arm. In the distance, smoke rose from Rastix's laboratory, and golems were already racing toward it to put out the fire. In the distance, he heard young voices. The children were playing in their playground near the dormitory that had been built for them. It was a peaceful sight, a welcome relief for his tired eyes, and a reminder of what he had worked so hard to create. Still, some things were in the process of changing. Further out, on a once unused section of his land, a new building was beginning to take shape. It didn't look like much yet, but he hoped it would one day become the foundation of industrialization. He knew it would be difficult to convince people of its value, especially with their heavy reliance on skills, but that was a challenge for another time. For now, he needed to focus on surviving the assembly and making it back in one piece. "I should at least enjoy the time I have." His fingers brushed over Agni's fur as the large wolf curled up at his side. Its eyes, usually alert, softened in his presence. Roland let himself breathe. Just for a moment. The smell of roasted vegetables and spiced meat drifted from the kitchen behind him, and he could hear Lydia humming softly, a familiar melody, one that always reminded him of simpler days. Days that he wished could last forever, but in this world ruled by power, such things were usually an illusion. "Dinner is ready." "Coming." Moments like these were becoming rare in his increasingly hectic life, but he held on to the belief that something better waited for him after the struggle. If reaching it meant achieving Tier 4, or even Tier 5, then he would make it happen. In the beginning, he had lived only for himself, driven by the need to survive. But things had changed. He had changed. Now, he was a different kind of man, one guided by something greater than survival alone. Soon, Roland sat at the table, surrounded by the simple warmth of his home. Elydia brought over plates filled with her cooking, and they chatted quietly about her new work at the school. The shop she used to manage was now run by a new worker, who was assisted by a few humanoid golems. And you know what he tried to do? No, what did he do? He tried eating the box of crayons. We were lucky that he spit it out. I think we need to get some better lockboxes for the school equipment. Haha. Roland laughed as Elydia continued recounting some of the events that had taken place at her workplace during the week. She was now the headmistress of their school, responsible for teaching young children the fundamentals, such as reading, writing, and basic mathematics. While it might not have seemed impressive to someone like him, who had gone through modern education, what they were doing in this world was entirely new. Were there any problems? Well, some of the merchants have been complaining. Elydia admitted while grumbling slightly. They have. She nodded. Not everyone was pleased about commoners receiving free education. Nobles and merchants often paid large sums to hire private tutors for their children, yet now the same knowledge was being offered freely to anyone who wanted it. Yes, they said it would disrupt the social order. As if that's such a great thing. He could see that his wife wasn't happy about it, but he also understood that change would come with some resistance. They'll accept it eventually. He replied while chewing on some vegetables. I hope you're right. She smiled, and they returned to their meal. For a brief moment, he considered whether he should increase the protection around the school. But before the thought could fully form, he felt a signal from Sebastian coming from within the workshop. It was magical, something only he could sense. It seemed that the man he rescued was finally awake and ready for questioning. Where am I? Hello, is anyone here? A man's voice echoed faintly in a sterile stone-walled room. He sat on a plain steel chair bolted to the floor, his posture stiff from lingering pain. His breathing was uneven. Although his wounds had been treated, he still felt the effects of the spores that had left him paralyzed. He appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, though hardship and sun exposure might have aged him beyond his years. Thick calluses covered his palms, and scars ran across his fingers. These were the hands of someone accustomed to swinging a hammer and working with metal. His short beard was tangled, and the dark rings under his eyes hinted at long nights without sleep. Despite having well-defined muscles, he looked leaner than he should have. It was clear that food had become a rare commodity in his life. The only source of light in the room came from a strange orb embedded in the ceiling above and produced a steady, non-flickering light. The man blinked slowly, his vision adjusting to the unnatural glow. Shadows stretched and warped along the featureless walls, twisting in rhythm with the spinning of the room, an after-effect of the spores. Without warning, the door to the room creaked open, and a lone figure stepped inside. It was a woman dressed in a maid uniform, but something was off. Large black cat ears rose from her head, and though her face was hidden behind a mask, it was clear she belonged to a feline beastman tribe. Her attire matched that of a traditional maid, yet her movements were silent, the kind only honed by years of deadly experience. Something the man could recognize thanks to having experience from watching adventurers. Who are you? The woman gave no reply. She simply approached the table at the center of the room. Her boots made no sound on the cold floor, and her masked face offered no hint of emotion or intent. In her hand, she held a small box covered in glowing runes. She placed it on the table in front of him. Without warning, the runes pulsed with a strange energy. The man's eyes widened. He had no idea where he was or whether he was in danger. The last thing he remembered was being dragged off by some kind of plant creature before everything went black. Now he was here, wherever here was. It felt like a dream, and for a moment, he wondered if he was dead. But this didn't feel like any afterlife he had heard of. He could still feel the lingering effects of the spores, and that was all too real. Please, place your hand on the device. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was strange and mechanical, lacking any trace of humanity. She pointed at the object on the table and said nothing else. What is that? He asked. His voice trembled, and his eye twitched as he stared at the pulsating runes. What do you want from me? Instinctively, he tried to push his chair back, but it didn't move. Only then did he realize that his left hand was locked to the chair, and both his ankles were restrained. Only his right hand remained free, clearly left that way so he could touch the box. "No. I'm not touching that thing." The woman didn't respond. She stepped forward and reached for him. He tried to move away, but his restraints held him tight. Her small hand gripped his wrist, and the pressure felt like a vice was holding him. "Wait! Stop!" he shouted, struggling in vain, but her grip didn't loosen. Despite her size, the strength in her hand overwhelmed his larger muscles. Soon, she forced his palm down onto the box. The moment contact was made, the runes flared with light. A surge of energy shot through his arm and into his head. He gasped as his eyes rolled back and a wave of unnatural comfort washed over him. "Good. Now, please tell me your name and your profession." She let go and stepped back. His mind felt strange, detached yet calm. He didn't try to pull his hand away. He no longer felt afraid. Now, answering her seemed like the most natural thing in the world. My name is Hermes. I'm a blacksmith." "Good. That matches the identification scan. The device is working." The woman nodded, then tilted her head toward the light above them. "Make sure you record all of this." The light flickered once, as if in response. Unbeknownst to the man, in a separate room far from the interrogation cell, 2 other women sat watching a large screen. They wore the same maid uniforms, their eyes fixed on the live feed streaming from the room. A golemic eye, hidden behind the ceiling light, captured every moment. "Do you think we should tell her about the grey hair? It's hard to miss from this angle." One of the women shifted in her seat, fidgeting with her hands. The other rolled her eyes and pinched the soft skin of her arm. "Take this seriously. If the head maid catches us slacking, we'll get reprimanded. Worse, our salary might be cut." "Ow!" The pinched maid yelped and rubbed her arm, shooting a quick glare at her partner. Her gaze drifted back to the screen, where the masked woman continued to question the man. Then, after a moment, she spoke again. "So, who do you prefer? The Lord or maybe the High Commander? I bet there's a real hunk under all that armor." "Ow! Hey, stop that!" Another quick pinch made her flinch again. "Only if you stop daydreaming and focus." A small tear appeared in the maid's eye, but this time she didn't argue. She let out a quiet sigh, reached for her notepad, and joined the other woman in silently recording the information their superiors demanded. They had been instructed to complete this task as quickly as possible and then move the man to a room with better furnishings. He was apparently not an enemy, but they were ordered to keep him confined without revealing their true identity or the fact that they were in Albrook. None of them knew where he had come from, and they understood it was wiser not to ask their superiors. Soon, the room filled with the sound of clicking and clacking as both maids began typing on devices that resembled modern keyboards. These were larger than their other-world counterparts and constructed almost entirely from metal. Thick cords connected them to small screens where a rudimentary word processor allowed them to record every detail. "Why are the letters arranged in this strange order and not alphabetically? Don't ask questions. Just keep working." "Fine." The louder maid frowned, clearly annoyed that her question had been ignored, but she returned to her task without further complaint. The keyboard was one of the many inventions developed by the High Commander, a brilliant figure respected by all in Albrook. Being among the first to use it was, in its own way, a reward. "Master, the report has arrived. Put it up on the big screen." Roland had eaten and endured a stern talk with his wife, who was not pleased that he would not be staying for the night. At the moment, he was inside his workshop, reviewing the information related to the blacksmith named Hermes. He had assigned the task to Mary, and she had sent out her maids to complete it. "They seem to have gotten used to the interrogation tools I've provided." Roland mumbled to himself as he watched through part of the recorded questioning. The box they used functioned similarly to a truth serum. It compelled anyone affected by it to speak only the truth. There were limitations, since individuals with high-tier classes and strong willpower could resist its effects. However, someone like this Tier 2 blacksmith would not be able to. There are some typos within the report. Those maids might need some more training and reading classes. He did not have time to watch the entire hour-long interrogation. The magic device he had created caused the affected person to speak very slowly, which made the process even more time-consuming. Instead, he had assigned maids to listen in, type out anything important, and send him a written report. The tool he provided was just a simple text editor with no features for correcting or detecting spelling mistakes, something he planned to improve if time ever allowed. There were scribing classes in the world that made recording information much easier, but their skills did not seem to carry over to typing on a runic screen with a text editor. Roland was not sure if the maids would eventually develop some new skill to ease this limitation, but it might be wiser in the future to have a proper scribe use their top-secret runic keyboard system instead. Now then. Roland scanned the report with his eyes, and a story quickly began to take shape. Through a series of questions, Roland had learned who the man was and why he had been left to die. He had been one of the apprentices of a Tier 3 blacksmith in the settlement, someone who was on the verge of advancing to an even higher tier. Apparently, a disagreement had arisen between the master and certain members of the ruling adventurer group. To make a point, they had tried to kill one of his apprentices. There were not many skilled craftsmen within the confines of that dungeon, and returning to the surface to recruit more was both expensive and dangerous. Because of this, those with influence often resorted to monopolizing the few craftsmen who were willing to live there. If no one volunteered, the guild would usually hire a Tier 3 craftsman to reside in the settlement, but once they arrived, the local laws took over. Controlling the craftsmen was a profitable strategy, since a great deal of money could be made through their services. Whoever is in charge there is probably trying to control the other adventurers by limiting their access to repairs. If someone cannot maintain their high-grade equipment, they risk missing out on valuable rewards. This was likely the core of the situation, but it complicated matters for Roland, who now had to decide what to do with the man. The questioning had also revealed that the blacksmith had a wife and a daughter still living in the settlement. His wife worked as a cook in one of the inns, alongside their teenage daughter. For now, it seemed they were safe and possibly being looked after by the master blacksmith, but Roland could not be certain of their fate. The men who had brought the blacksmith to the plant appeared to have their own hidden agenda. The most reasonable course of action was to report the case to the guild in Isgard and let them handle it. However, he couldn't be sure how far the corruption had spread within the guild ranks. If those in charge were either complicit or indifferent, then the blacksmith and his family might be in even greater danger than before. Sebastian. Yes, master. I need you to contact the guild master. I'm sure he has more information about the Isgard guild than we do. Although Roland knew the names of the guild leaders, he had not gathered any detailed information about them. It was probably best to make sure he was not walking into a wasp nest, or if he was, that he had enough firepower to handle it. As you wish, master. After giving Sebastian a few more orders related to gathering intelligence, Roland made his way back to the teleportation gate chamber. Time was critical, and he still needed to grow stronger before reaching the Valyrian Duke's estate. He understood how extravagant nobles could be, and even duels might break out during their visit. Each of the brothers was allowed to bring only a limited number of guards, and only one personal guard would be permitted inside the Duke's castle. This would be his main role, and he had not yet decided how to approach it. Most of his strength came from his armor and runic enhancements, but bringing in magical equipment above a certain power level was forbidden. As things stood, he would need to leave his main armor with the rest of the troops stationed outside or hide it somewhere closer to the castle. Doing so, however, could be seen as an act of treason or an attempted attack on a noble's life. Well, at this point, it would be strange if it were easy. Over the years, he had come to find the events unfolding around him more irritating than anything else, but he was beginning to make peace with the chaos of his extraordinary life. He understood that more obstacles would inevitably appear, and making the right moves to protect himself and those he cared about had become a routine part of his existence. He was not sure if it was healthy to think this way, always looking over his shoulder, but for now, he had accepted it. His armored form moved through the teleportation gate, and he reappeared inside his small secret lair hidden within the dungeon. He glanced toward the console, which activated at once. A viewer display was ready, showing logs similar to an event tracker. The golems he had left behind were programmed to record any abnormalities and mark timestamps for later analysis. For now, however, nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Just a few monsters wandering around. I made the right choice building this safe house here. Now that everything was in place, it was time to expand his influence throughout the dungeon. He had restocked all of his sensors and had enough to deploy across the entire area. Once the network was fully set up, not a single creature, adventurer, or even a drifting spore would escape his notice. Time to get to work. Maybe once I'm done, I'll be able to bring Agni in here too, but for now, it's too dangerous. As he floated up through the lone opening, he thought about his fiery companion. The wolf had not been pleased about being left behind during the dungeon exploration. Both of Agni's forms were rare, and his level was only just high enough to handle the lesser dragon-type monsters that roamed these depths. Before Roland could allow him into the dungeon, he needed to make sure neither the monsters nor the adventurers could pose a threat. For now, this mission required stealth, and he could not trust his wolf to stay quiet. Once outside, his crimson-scaled armor shimmered with something resembling starlight. Just like the surface, this place followed a day and night cycle. It was synchronized with the real world above, which made it easier to move unnoticed during the darker hours. The area was dim, but nothing his enhanced vision could not handle. He immediately noticed that the plant monster he had defeated earlier had returned to its original spot. This time, however, it was already agitated. It seemed that some monsters grew more aggressive during the night, which in a way made hunting them easier. With a hand gesture, a torrent of fire surged forward and engulfed the flesh-eating plant once more. As before, the creature stood no chance and was destroyed within seconds. But to Roland's surprise, the blaze did not scare the surrounding monsters away. Instead, it drew them in. Multiple creatures of the same type began crawling toward him, as if they had sensed that he was in urgent need of experience points. Soon, a controlled inferno erupted as he spun in place, setting every nearby plant monster ablaze. His armor, designed to amplify the power of his fire spells, was perfectly suited for extermination, and tonight, the dungeon would become a sea of flames. Ash fell around him like snow while he burned through the advancing creatures. When some of them caught fire, they let out high-pitched screeches that were quickly silenced by the sound barrier his golems had set up around the area. "Congratulations, you have leveled up." "Not bad, that's one level down." At first, he had wondered where the best place to level up would be. After surveying the area more carefully, he realized this location was far more efficient than he had expected. In addition to the plant-based monsters that yielded a decent amount of experience, there were also plant-type draconids nearby that he could target next. He stepped forward into the darkness. The lingering embers drifted toward him, drawn into the red scales of his armor, which pulsed faintly with heat. Time was running short, but he was confident that within the few days he had left, he could reach level 50. All he could do now was hope that the effort would be worth it, and that the gods who granted skills would show him mercy. Fungalfang Lindworm L231. No wonder people avoid this area with monsters like these. Roland muttered, hiding behind a tree as he watched the strange creature. It was a lindworm variant, which was a type of lesser dragon. Lindworms resembled large, snake-like creatures with scaly reptilian bodies. They had two powerful forelimbs, often clawed, but no hind legs, which made them appear to slither or crawl. Their heads were dragon-like, lined with sharp teeth and sometimes marked by glowing eyes. But this one was different. Its body was slick with patches of bioluminescent fungus that pulsed in slow, eerie rhythms. Mushrooms the size of dinner plates sprawled across the monster's back. Along the side of its long neck were strange, spore-filled growths. With each breath, these growths released a peculiar mist into the surrounding environment. It was clear this creature posed a serious health hazard, and without proper gear to prevent inhalation, hunting it would be extremely difficult. I wonder what those spores do, could it just be a paralysis effect or something more? For a moment, he considered whether it might be possible to weaponize the monster's natural defenses. This creature was relatively high level, and even Tier 3 class holders were hesitant to wander into the area. The spores clearly affected them as well and might be transformed into a usable weapon. Still, he hesitated. Developing a biological weapon in this world might not be a good idea. The people here lacked deep knowledge of monster biology, and most alchemical research focused on creating new potions and elixirs. At best, someone could collect these spores and store them in a container similar to a bomb to spread them in battle. However, such a tactic would also affect allied troops and could be blown away with magical winds, which made it hard to use. Roland didn't move right away. The Fungalfang Lindworm lingered at the edge of his vision, slowly slithering through the glade. With help from his visor and internal runic sensors, he could tell the air was saturated with dangerous spores. If they entered his airways, they would likely infect him with some kind of ailment. In some cases, these tiny particles could zombify humans like him, turning them into fungal zombies. To the unprepared or those without proper equipment, this was a deadly environment. However, Roland knew the monster's major weakness: fire. The spores floating in the air were highly flammable, and he had already confirmed this through testing. This lindworm variant was composed of fungal and plant matter. Although its scales resembled those of green dragons, they were not made of true flesh. Its breath attack did not produce heat but instead released poison or other forms of disease. The time to hunt had come, and Roland had donned his rune salamander armor for exactly this purpose. Of all the monsters in the dungeon, this mushroom-covered creature was probably the easiest for him to face. In many ways, it was the ideal opponent. Other adventurers avoided this part of the dungeon, which made it the perfect place for him to gain a few more levels without interference. The only concern was containing the flames to avoid drawing attention to his presence. A squadron of floating golems had already taken to the air, spreading out to cover the entire area. Some positioned themselves on the ground, others perched in the trees, each stationed precisely to enclose the section of the glade where the hunt would take place. Gradually, a containment dome began to form around him, sealing off the area and ensuring he remained hidden from any prying eyes. Good, with this, I can run wild a bit, even if someone appears afterwards, they shouldn't be able to find my hideout. With a final check of the containment dome, Roland advanced. He stepped out from behind the tree, and the runes across his armor flared to life, cloaking him in a thick layer of flame. The spores in the air around him ignited instantly. The reaction was immediate, revealing just how dense the flammable particles had become. The air shimmered with heat as fire surged outward, triggering a volatile chain reaction that raced toward the lesser dragon. The fungal fang lindworm reared back and unleashed a thunderous roar that shook the surrounding trees. The flames clearly agitated it, but its body remained mostly unharmed. Instead of retreating, it grew enraged. Its eyes narrowed as it scanned the glade, searching for the source of the fire, and soon locked onto Roland. What the monster saw was a man in blazing armor, standing still as the center of his chest plate opened to reveal a rune-powered beam emitter. A radiant crimson orb pulsed at its core, flames swirling around it as it charged. The lindworm roared again and lunged, aiming to crush him with its massive form. Before it could reach him, the beam fired, releasing a focused torrent of flame that met the charge head-on. The monster froze as it saw the strange energy surge toward it. In a desperate attempt to defend itself, it opened its massive jaws and released a brownish cloud of noxious gas, a breath ability known for inflicting a wide range of status effects. This attack was commonly referred to as disease breath. However, the beam struck with the force of a miniature sun. It tore through the toxic cloud, igniting it in an instant. With no more opposition, the beam then crashed directly into the lindworm's open mouth. Roland had expected the monster to be thrown back, but his attack proved far more powerful than he had anticipated. A strange chain reaction unfolded as not only the disease breath ignited, but the monster's insides did as well. The beam pierced its body completely, and in a sudden burst of energy, the lindworm erupted into flames. The explosion rocked the glade. Roland flinched, not from fear but from sheer surprise. Bits of charred mushroom flesh and burning scale rained from the sky, some pieces striking the containment dome before fizzling out. The thick, spore-filled air had ignited like paper soaked in oil. Where the lindworm once slithered, only a blackened crater remained. I didn't expect that to happen. He couldn't tell whether it was a stroke of luck or if his equipment was simply far more powerful than he had realized. In the Albrook dungeon, he had used divine energy to deal with skeletons and assumed the monsters were just unusually weak. This lesser dragon, however, had been several levels above him and quite large. Yet now, it was reduced to ash before his eyes. All that remained was its mana stone and a few scorched internal organs, which he wasn't sure he even wanted to take with him. I suppose this is the drawback of burning plant monsters. Not much is left to collect. At least when he had defeated the worms, he was able to retrieve their claws, eyes, and even hearts. This fungal creature had been incinerated so thoroughly that anything valuable was either destroyed or still burning. Though he hadn't gained much beyond the mana stone, Roland felt no frustration. His main goal was still to train and increase his level. If he could take down monstrosities like this with a single well-placed beam, then this was a rare opportunity. Even better, more monsters were already approaching his position, and he had enough time to set himself up for another strike. Ha, maybe this will be a lot easier than I expected. Roland didn't have long to enjoy his unexpected success. The burning remains of the lindworm acted like a signal flare in the night. While the smoke and flames couldn't escape the barrier his golems maintained, the creatures inside it could still see them. Soon, movement appeared on his display, accompanied by a chorus of similar roars from the distance. I guess I won't have to go find them myself after all. With a quiet chuckle, he got ready. Most people would have been terrified by the unknown nature of the dungeon, but Roland wasn't like most people. Surrounded by sensors and supported by flying golems feeding him live footage, he felt in control. He immediately turned to the east, preparing for the next encounter. Moments later, the trees began to shift as another lesser dragon appeared. Fungal Fang Lindworm L232. The pattern repeated itself. The monster charged at him just like the last one. Roland waited for the right moment, and when the creature unleashed its breath attack, he countered with a focused beam of flame energy. The result was immediate and explosive. A second blast tore through the glade, leaving another scorched lindworm corpse behind. Despite having defeated two monsters at higher levels than his own, he still didn't gain a full level. This was the harsh reality of high-level advancement and the reason so few ever reached Tier 4. Real progress only came from regularly defeating foes far stronger than oneself, something most people who valued their lives refused to do. For Roland, however, who always acted with a plan and sought power to protect himself and those he cared about, this was more than acceptable. The next few hours passed in a blur of roaring fire, toxic spores, and shattered fungi-scaled bodies. They kept coming, and he continued to blast them to pieces. The slaughter went on through the entire night, and only when his rune beam emitter began to falter did Roland finally bring his nightly conquest to an end. Probably best not to leave it like this. When he was finished, he switched to his water-based runic armor. With it equipped, he summoned water to extinguish the lingering flames, then absorbed the resulting steam. Only after confirming that nothing could escape outside did he command his golems to retreat and return to hiding. With the hunt complete, Roland made his way back to his concealed shelter to perform some repairs and take a moment to rest. The mini spiders are doing well. While inside his hiding place, he looked at his console. There, he saw the ever-expanding range of his scanners. The floating golems were not the only ones he had deployed this time. As his rune condensing skills improved each day, creating smaller golems had become increasingly feasible. The spider golems he had sent out featured egg-shaped bodies with 6 nimble legs. Their purpose was to move through the area and hide themselves in various locations, and to act as signal magnifiers and sensors. He was now beginning to slowly encroach on the human settlement located some distance away. One of his small spider units had just burrowed into the soil near the outskirts of the town. The blacksmith he had rescued had also provided him with the settlement's name, Dragon Valley Settlement. It wasn't a proper name for a true town, but this wasn't a proper town either. There were no farms nearby, and most of the inhabitants were adventurers or people who supported them. I should take it slow, I can't risk being found out now. The current leader of the settlement was a powerful adventurer and a member of a mithril-ranked team. Roland had gathered some of their names already, but the blacksmith had not been a reliable source when it came to their actual strengths. Instead, Roland had tasked his agents with collecting records and information on them. Now then, back to work. After completing some repairs, he was ready to head out again. The flame beam had proven highly effective against the monsters, but it consumed his mana reserves at an alarming rate. It had been designed as a finishing move to end battles quickly, not as a weapon to be fired continuously. Even so, it remained his most effective tool against the spore-filled lesser dragons. Once he was certain that no adventurers were approaching, he resumed the grind. As the next day began beneath the dungeon's artificial sky, Roland stood once more in the scorched glade. The monster corpses had vanished, but the vegetation had yet to fully recover. The dungeon's healing process appeared much slower when it came to the environment, but he assumed that within 2 or 3 days, all traces of the battle would be gone. Another roar echoed in the distance, and he returned to his task. The flaming inferno of his armor blazed against the monsters that remained, and with each victory, his level steadily increased. Every defeated foe brought him closer to the milestone he had been working toward, and now he was just 1 level away from reaching the midpoint he so eagerly anticipated. Is this something like an area boss? Haifeng Galfang Lindworm L240. One last creature stood in his way. This dragon was a head taller than any of the lindworms he had encountered so far. A strange purplish miasma drifted from its body, and the air around it was thick with spores. To make matters worse, the mist appeared to have a resistance to flame. Even when surrounded by his burning aura, the spores in the area did not fully burn. Lesser effectiveness, but it should still be enough. It was clear that this rarer variant would not be defeated as easily. Even though his level had now reached 224, the monster still out-leveled him by more than 10. Its stat multiplier was likely higher than that of the draconids he had fought earlier. Even so, tougher opponents brought greater rewards, and Roland was certain that this creature would grant him the final experience points he needed to reach his goal. Thus, just like with the previous monsters, he aimed to strike once the creature used its breath attack. The lindworm opened its maw and released a stream of purplish miasma. When the moment was right, Roland fired his beam of condensed flame. This time, however, the result was different. Although the attack connected just as it had with the other lesser dragons, there was no explosion afterward. It's not generating the same reaction. He had somewhat expected this outcome the moment he noticed that some of the spores were not burning completely. The monster's internal structure wasn't as flammable as he had hoped. It was now clear that he would have to defeat it in a more traditional way. Roland quickly shifted to the side as the monster charged, narrowly avoiding a swipe from one of its massive clawed hands. Moments later, he launched his counterattack. His flame armor had been designed to support close-quarters combat through the use of his fists. As soon as the monster's flank was exposed, he stepped in and delivered a swift right hook, his fist engulfed in searing flame energy. A booming sound echoed as his fist struck the monster's scaly hide. The tough scales cracked under the force, and fire surged through the gaps, causing the lindworm to howl in fury. Some of the purplish spores and mushrooms covering its body were engulfed in flames and burned away, but the battle was far from over. The monster lunged again, using its front limbs as its primary weapons. Roland moved like a seasoned boxer, bobbing and weaving around each massive swipe. He countered every time an opening revealed itself. Charred holes began to spread across the creature's body as his attacks landed with increasing precision. Finally, one last flame-covered fist struck the lindworm's jaw with crushing force, ending its life and sending it into the afterlife. The beast collapsed with a resonating thud, smoke trailing from its cracked scales and scorched fungus flesh. Roland stood over it, panting lightly, the flames cloaking his armor beginning to flicker. The high-tier lindworm twitched once, then fell still. The purplish miasma that had stubbornly resisted his flames began to dissipate at last, no longer sustained by the monster's life force. Congratulations, you have leveled up. What he had been waiting for had finally arrived. He had reached level 225. Most people would have been able to reach level 50 with their first tier 3 class by the time they hit level 200. This was one of the downsides of the path he had chosen, and it had become apparent. Even so, with the dungeon offering such high-level monsters, he was confident he had made the right decision. Now then, this better be good. You have gained the Overlord's Indomitable Will passive skill. You have gained the Rune Concealment active skill. Oh! 2 skills. To Roland's surprise and delight, he had not gained just 1 skill but 2. He quickly scanned their descriptions and couldn't help grinning beneath his helmet. If the information was accurate, then one of his major concerns for the upcoming mission had just been resolved. Small mechanical legs clicked softly as an egg-shaped spider climbed a steep wooden wall. Rather than digging its legs in, it clung to the surface by magnetizing itself to the high metallic content within the wood. Slowly, it reached the top and used its single large eye to scan the surroundings. Nearby, it spotted a lone guard leaning against the wall of his lookout tower, completely inattentive and struggling to stay awake. I shouldn't have drunk that ale, the boss will kill me if I fall asleep, I need to hang in there. The man mumbled to himself while the small arachnid scanned the surrounding environment. It fed the visual data into the main console hidden within Roland's shelter and also transmitted valuable information to dozens of other spider units that were slowly approaching the area. One group was already closing in on the circular wall, preparing to infiltrate the interior. The spider adjusted its posture, flattening its body to blend into the support beam. Its matte black shell shimmered faintly as it merged with the unlit shadows of the night. Although the dungeon had shifted into its night cycle, the adventurer-run town remained active. A transparent barrier shaped like a dome blocked sounds from escaping, but now that the small golemic arachnid had reached its vantage point, its sensors picked up a large amount of noise and movement inside. People were walking around and shouting. This was clearly a place meant for adventurers, as almost everyone was carrying a pitcher of alcohol and appeared to be drunk. The noise provided excellent cover, allowing the small golem to blend in easily and proceed with infiltration. It descended along the wall and, upon reaching a building, began burrowing into the ground deep enough to remain hidden, yet shallow enough to eavesdrop on every nearby conversation. In time, many more of the egg-sized arachnids began scaling the walls of the Dragon Valley settlement. They slipped inside and continued burrowing underground, spreading throughout the area. The man behind the infiltration watched a screen as the once empty map gradually filled with detailed renditions of the exteriors. Thanks to the scanners, he could now see every building rendered in three-dimensional space. Although the golems did not actively stream visual feeds, the scanners still detected the presence of adventurers, displaying them as moving dots similar to those on his original mapping device. This time, however, there was also sound. The DRA, KSHHHH have been rowdy lat, KRRZT I heard a rampage BZZZZZT, could occur at any moment, SHHHK. A man's voice came through the feed. At first, there was some static, but after a few adjustments, it began to come through clearly. KZZZ. Why are you talking about this now? Just shut up and drink. Ha, you're right. No use worrying now. We'll get through it like we always do. The conversation came from inside a rowdy tavern not far from what appeared to be the central square. With all the overlapping audio inputs from outside, it was difficult to make out exactly what people were saying. Still, given enough time, Roland hoped to gather enough information to prepare for whoever was in charge of the settlement. From how the blacksmith had been treated, the place didn't seem to follow any clear laws. But he couldn't be sure of who to blame yet. It was possible that multiple factions were working against one another and that the leader held no real control over them. Everything is progressing smoothly. That should be enough for now. In his small underground lair, Roland stood before the console. He watched as the map took shape in real time and had already made the decision to keep all his golems underground, avoiding any placements in higher vantage points. The dungeon floor was saturated with mana, which would help conceal the spider golems from mages and other detection skills. The underground net is now set up. His golems were designed to exchange information with each other through an underground network. They kept sending signals horizontally to avoid detection, and for now, it seemed to be working effectively. The adventurers living here probably never expected anyone from outside to be monitoring their entire settlement from every direction. As long as none of his golems were uncovered, he expected to remain hidden. Even if one of them was discovered, it was built to self-destruct and leave no trace behind. Without both a runesmith and a rune mage working together, no one would be able to trace the signal back to his current location. Then, if they managed to do so, he could still escape through the teleportation gate and destroy his hidden lair to eliminate all evidence. Now then, the blacksmith's home should be somewhere around here. While his main reason for placing sensors around the settlement was to gather information on the residents, he also had a secondary objective. The two men who had nearly killed the blacksmith he questioned had mentioned something about the man's family. As someone who had his own loved ones, this didn't sit well with him. If he ignored it now, his conscience would likely keep him awake at night. This might take a while, let's give the order to filter for any mentions of the name Hermes. After giving the order, he leaned back and turned toward his status screen. He was now a level 50 runesmith overlord, and for one reason or another, this advancement had granted him not just one new skill but two. Rune Concealment. Active skill. Allows the runesmith to hide previously created runes from sight and detection by other spells and abilities. He first examined the active skill Rune Concealment. At a glance, it didn't seem particularly impressive as it simply allowed him to hide runes from view. However, after testing it, the results were unexpectedly remarkable. Quite fascinating, it's as if there was nothing there from the start. He said as he reached out with his hand, which was encased in armor. The runes were engraved on various parts and also on the underside of the armor's plating, and whenever he cast spells, they would usually flash and emit mana. While there were already methods for masking such traces, none were perfect. Yet once he activated the skill, the vibrant glow began to fade until his gauntlet appeared entirely devoid of magic. If I didn't know something was there. It was a remarkable ability that concealed all traces of runic magic. Once activated, it consumed a steady amount of mana to keep the runes hidden on any target he chose. As long as the runes remained inactive, they would stay undetectable. The only limitation was its continuous mana cost, similar to a buff spell. When used on objects, the concealment lasted for a limited time, no more than 10 minutes. With this skill, they shouldn't be able to detect anything. Only one day remained before his departure to Isgard. There was a major problem with the assembly as he couldn't bring his full arsenal with him. Although he had created several methods to summon his gear within seconds, they were problematic solutions. In a world where Tier 3 and Tier 4 class holders fought, even a fraction of a second could mean death. He had built a special launch platform that could fire his armor into the air, allowing him to leap up and equip it midair. It felt like a ridiculous transformation sequence, and he was glad he likely wouldn't have to use it. If he could conceal the runic equipment he wore, he could simply store everything inside a spatial container. But if he could smuggle gear in, it meant others might be able to do the same. I might be overthinking things, but there were aspects of this assembly that unsettled him because they broke from tradition. He understood how nobles clung to their customs and only abandoned them in the face of extreme circumstances. He didn't want to expect trouble, but the second skill he had acquired was designed for situations where attacks came without warning. Overlord's Indomitable Will. Passive skill. This skill activates automatically when the Overlord's health drops below 20%. Upon activation, it fully restores health and mana, resets the cooldowns of all Overlord class skills, and extends their active durations. Additionally, it grants a temporary boost to durability and resilience. Can only trigger once per day. This one sounds like it's giving me a second phase. While the first skill had helped him resolve a recent dilemma, the second possessed far more dramatic potential. It was a passive ability that only activated when he was critically injured, but once triggered, the effects were astonishing. Not only would it restore him to full health and replenish all his mana, it would also allow him to unleash his Overlord's might again, this time for an extended duration. It was a skill meant for desperate situations, and though he wanted to test it, intentionally lowering his health below 20% was a dangerous gamble. Although he was no stranger to pain, he decided for now not to resort to self-harm. The skill was useful, but he had no intention of ever needing it in the future. With careful planning and thorough research, he would ensure that such a situation never arose. Still, it was reassuring to have this ability when faced with overwhelming danger. His enemies would likely never anticipate him gaining a second wind ability similar to those found in certain creatures. Perhaps the Overlord class truly was connected to monsters, and he could only wonder what kind of skill he would unlock upon reaching level 100. Before he had time to think further, his monitor flashed. It seemed that someone had mentioned the name of the blacksmith he had rescued. He quickly ordered the nearest underground spider drone to focus on the conversation. Where is he? It's been several days. Those bastards did something. It must be that man. It's because Father's master refused to repair his weapon. Millie, keep your voice down. What if someone hears you? But, Mother. I know, but still, this is not what your father would want. If you bring this up with those people, there is no telling what they could do. Roland listened closely. The girl named Millie appeared to be the blacksmith's daughter. During the interrogation, the man had given them this very name, so he assumed this was the person he had been referring to. Knowing that the two were alive and safe brought him some relief. Millie's tone and words made her anger clear. Her mother was trying to calm her down, likely out of fear that speaking too openly could attract attention from dangerous people. They seemed to be ordinary commoners with no combat abilities, likely relying on others for protection. Roland wished he could help them more, but doing so would risk exposing himself to adventurers. There was no guaranteed way to get in and extract the two women. Even if he managed to infiltrate the area as he had during Lucille's rescue, they would likely refuse to cooperate. The capabilities of the adventurers remained uncertain, and there was also the growing issue with the lesser draconic monsters in the dungeon. These creatures had become more agitated and violent, causing most of the adventurers to remain inside their settlement. This made any attempt at infiltration much more difficult. Half of the residents there were Tier 3 class holders, and some were even mithril-ranked adventurers who were only one step away from reaching Tier 4. I'll see to it once I'm back, but for now, you'll have to hold on. Roland leaned back from the console. The infiltration mission had ended, and none of the adventurers had detected his small golems hidden around their headquarters. Due to the increased agitation among monsters, the surrounding mana concentration had also risen, which made it easier to conceal the golem's presence even with more adventurers nearby. I should head back. Arthur will be going through his final attempts soon. It was time to leave. He had done all he could in this short window within the dungeon. While he wished he could spend a few months here grinding levels, retreat was necessary. His base of operations was assembled, and the monitoring system was partially complete. With everything in place, he could continue gathering data on both the adventurers and the monsters they fought. By the time he returned after the assembly, he would have a detailed list of their strengths, weaknesses, class types, and even party names. All of this would give him an edge if he chose to act. When he returned, he planned to infiltrate their base properly and determine whether he could use it to his advantage. Soon, the gate activated, and he stepped through, arriving in his workshop. Only one day remained until their departure. Arthur had one final chance to reach Tier 3 on his third attempt. If he failed, he would be forced to leave, as he was a Tier 2. This might be his only opportunity to prove his progress to his father, an opportunity that could open the path for him to be considered a legitimate heir candidate. As things stood, Roland was uncertain whether Arthur, as an illegitimate son, could ever claim that title. Fortunately, some nobles valued ability more than bloodline purity. Perhaps Arthur could become one of the rare few born out of wedlock who went on to lead their family. It's a hard road he chose for himself. Roland watched the teleportation gate fizzle out while his thoughts turned to the future. Arthur was not hiding, he was doing the opposite, making himself known to the other nobles and especially to his father. This approach contrasted sharply with how Roland had lived for most of his life, always trying to stay out of sight, avoiding his family and the world around him. But time had taught him that hiding would never be enough. Only by gaining power and forging strong alliances could he hope to secure the freedom he longed for. While thinking about the future, he stepped forward and walked into his armory. His armor detached from his body and was placed on a rack beside his 4 main elemental sets. Some of the slots were empty because he had not yet completed all of the sets, though several pieces were partially finished. He reached for one of these, a single armored glove polished in white. The piece looked pale, as if it had been coated in snow-colored paint. When he held it and channeled mana into the runic components, a warm glow filled the entire room. After nodding, he picked up a different gauntlet, this one pitch black. When activated, it emitted a dim, shadowy glow that immediately began to drain his vitality. He quickly deactivated the effect, realizing it was more potent than intended. This should be enough for now. When the test was completed, he set both gauntlets aside. After inspecting all of his gear and confirming that everything was in order, he received a message from the city lord. It was time for the final attempt, and this time he would take part in the trial instead of Sebastian. Just as they had done during the 2 previous attempts, they gathered in the memory chamber and prepared to begin. "Are you ready?" Arthur stood there, more determined than ever. He responded with a strong nod and quickly got onto the chair. "I will not fail again." "I can't." "I see." Roland replied while fiddling with the panel controls. Arthur looked past him, not quite focused on the question. It was as if his eyes were lingering on the image of his father standing behind Roland. There was exhaustion in his gaze, and it was clear that he had gone several days without sleep. "Once the trial begins, your body will feel refreshed, but it's still better to get some rest beforehand." Roland gave him some advice, but this only made Arthur chuckle drily. "Sleep? At a time like this? That's not happening, my friend." "I suppose you're right. Let's begin then. Good luck." Soon, Arthur grasped the crystal and was transported back into the Ascension trial space. Roland remained behind, gathering data and waiting for his return. He could only begin recording once the trial ended completely and the brain was fully flooded with the returning memories. It's taking longer than before. Even though it was only half a second longer than the previous attempt, it was a promising sign. At last, the monitors flickered to life, and Roland began watching the stream of memories playing out from within the trial. For a moment, he stopped before one picture, his mouth becoming wider. "Wait, what is this? No, did he?" For a moment, he was speechless, his eyes twitching in disbelief, but he could not deny what he was seeing.